Good morning. Thank you for responding. My name is Donald Stanton. I'm the president of Oglethorpe University, and it's with great pleasure that on behalf of Jack Gwynn and his colleagues at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and my colleagues at Oglethorpe University that I'm able to welcome you to the Miriam H. and John A. Conant Performing Arts Center on our campus. You are busy people, but I hope that at least some of you will take a few moments to reflect while you're here, to walk around the campus a little bit and see a little bit of what it's like to be near students and faculty again. For example, if you have time, you may want to stop by at the Oglethorpe University Museum, where there are personal items that belong to the Dalai Lama. We invite you to visit our museum anytime between 12 and 5 o'clock this afternoon. It's at the third floor of the Philip Weltner Library, which is directly in front of this building. The panelists today will be dealing with some fundamental issues which have an impact on the lives of all people, including those gathered here and indeed all of us. A university sometimes seems to be an isolated place of learning. We have a wall around this campus. We have Gothic architecture. We see faculty and students in conversation and what may appear to an outsider to be quiet reflection. But we at Oglethorpe University, along with our colleagues at other colleges and universities, watch very closely as economic leaders make decisions that will have an impact on us as well as others. Think for just a brief moment about the impact on higher education as these issues are worked through. Inflation is not just a number. It has an impact on what it costs us to do business, even as it costs you to do your work. It has an impact on what our charges will be. Economic prosperity, which has been so exciting in recent times, or the lack of economic prosperity, makes a real difference about whether families can invest tuition in private colleges and universities, or state institutions for that matter. Unemployment, fortunately low today, has over the years had a real influence on some colleges and universities. I remember when I was president of a private college in Michigan that the economy began to fall apart. Not only did we have double-digit inflation, but unemployment in Michigan was increasingly frightening. And it affected in a very direct and personal way the students who were unable to pay the tuition, and it meant a difference as to whether they could stay in college or not. The stock market appears to be something of interest for people of wealth, but it is increasingly important to all of us. Our endowment relates, of course, to the market. And personally, there are some of us who call up on our computers almost daily TIAA CREF data, and as the market goes up, we smile at each other, and if the market shows signs of trembling, we tremble too. The deficit or the surplus affects us. It's obvious that a negative impact comes from a deficit. A surplus sometimes causes us to get excited so that when college presidents get together, they say, well, with this new surplus, that will mean money, won't it, for scholarships, for humanities, for science. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it does not. The point is that these are not abstract issues, but they are vital issues for all of us. And we listen with interest, along with those of you gathered here in this group, to what these experts will say. We appreciate their leadership. We are excited about the gathering of so much intellectual power in one place at one time. We're genuinely grateful to these leaders for what they have done through the years and for what they are continuing to do, and for taking the time to share relevant, important information with us today. I want to thank especially Jack Gwynn, my colleague in this project, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and a trustee, I'm happy to say, of Oglethorpe University. I want to express appreciation to Mr. Bob Eisenbeis, Senior Vice President and Director of Economic Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and to Dr. Bill Shropshire, Callaway Professor at Oglethorpe University. Dr. Shropshire and Mr. Eisenbeis conceived the idea for this symposium and organized the program. And Dr. Shropshire at this time has the privilege of introducing our very distinguished panelist, Dr. William Shropshire.
The original idea for this symposium was actually that of Dr. Dean Tucker, the chair of Oglethorpe's Division of Business Administration and Economics. And when Dr. Tucker first thought of this, he said we should arrange this symposium to coincide with the establishment of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, the 50th anniversary of that establishment. Well, those of you who know your history realize we missed that by about 2 years. The founding was actually in 1946, not 1948. Dr. Tucker's other idea was that we assemble a panel of people from the current and previous administrations, from the Council and from the Board of Governors. In this second objective, we have succeeded wonderfully, I must say. We have assembled here an outstanding panel, and all those who have been aware of both policy making and policy research for any part of the last 20 years will agree with me that this panel is indeed outstanding. I want to introduce the panel to you in chronological order, that is the order in which they began their service. Yeah, not age. This is only when they began their service. And I'll start then with Lyle Gramley, who was appointed to the Council of Economic Advisors in 1977. He also served on the Board of Governors beginning in 1980. The second, and this is Mr. Gramley here. I don't know whether you can see the signs or not. Mr. Gramley here. And then next is Nancy Teeters, who was appointed to the Board of Governors in 1978. Third is Robert Heller, to my right here. He was appointed to the Board of Governors in 1986. Next is John Taylor on the end on my left, who was appointed to the Council of Economic Advisors in 1989. And then Paul Wanacott to my right, who was appointed to the Council in 1991. And then Janet Yellen on my left, who was appointed to the Board of Governors in 1994, and then to the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in 1997. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Mr. Jack Gwynn, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, who will moderate the panel.
Thank you, Bill, and let me add my good morning and welcome to everyone that's here with us today. The Atlanta Fed is delighted and pleased to be Oglethorpe's partner in bringing you this program today. As we approach the new millennium, we find ourselves in the 8th year of an economic expansion that has brought us a combination of strong growth, low inflation, and low unemployment that we have not seen in this country since the 1960s. These days, those of us in economic policy-making roles in this country are constantly being asked two fundamental questions over and over again. First, why is the U.S. economy performing so well at the moment? And second, can it last, and what can we do to help that happen? To help us answer these questions and see what lessons we can learn for the future, we have the extraordinary group of former and current members of the Council of Economic Advisors and the Fed Board of Governors that have just been introduced to you by Bill. To frame this morning's discussion, I would note that some observers and some economic practitioners are talking about a new economic paradigm in which the traditional measures of things like capacity utilization, sustainable economic growth, and the natural rate of unemployment may either not be relevant or not quantified as they were in the past. Others, after working through the various factors that seem to have contributed to our current economic prosperity, have concluded that better economic policy, both fiscal policy and monetary policy, is the most important explanation of what's going on. Clearly, one of the dividends of our well-performing economy has been the prospect of a federal budget surplus as early as this year, after years of large federal deficits. What should we do with that new surplus? Return it to the taxpayer, who is presently more heavily burdened by government tax policy than ever before? Or should we plan to redirect those funds to address the tough problems that anyone who looks in the future over the next 25 years will see? Namely, a host of big bills coming due to fund Social Security and Medicare. And then in the realm of monetary policy, where we have had little recent experience with policy formulation in a low inflation environment, what should our guide be to policy, and what are the trade-offs of targeting an even lower level of inflation? And then how should we be thinking about our more global economy, how developments in one part of the world can quickly spread across continents? The Oglethorpe and Atlanta Fed organizers today's event felt that the insights of those who have been policymakers and who are current policymakers and advisors might be especially insightful as we try to answer those kinds of questions. Let me tell you our plan for the morning. First, each of our distinguished speakers will make a short statement addressing one or more of the economic issues of the day. After we've heard from all of our panelists, we'll take a short break. After that break, we'll come back and reconvene for an open discussion among the panelists, and I suspect that will be lively and provocative. And then we're going to leave time at the end for some interaction between the audience and the panel, with Q&A and some debate back and forth among the larger group. I'm going to come back in the audience and join you for the first discussions. Dr. Janet Yellen will begin with her views, and then each of the other panelists in turn will come to the microphone. Janet, welcome to the podium.
Thank you, Jack. It's a pleasure for me to participate today in a discussion of economic priorities for the United States in the 21st century. I think this is an opportune moment to look forward, not only because the 21st century is close at hand, but also because we're enjoying, as Jack mentioned, the best economic performance we've seen in decades, with unemployment and inflation at the lowest levels in a generation, and also a federal budget that's in near balance. If we maintain the fiscal discipline that's now in place, budget surpluses over the next decade are projected to reach $1 trillion. And I think it's in good economic times like these that we have the luxury and the resources to anticipate problems ahead and have the foresight to prepare for them. In my opening remarks, I'd like to focus on two entirely different 21st century economic problems that I think command our attention now. One is Social Security, the other is an environmental problem, namely climate change. Let me begin by talking about Social Security reform, which the President deemed top priority in his State of the Union address. In fact, the President today is in Kansas City participating in the Social Security Forum this morning, and it's the first of many such fora to be held around the country this year that will allow Americans to explore alternative solutions to the problems of the Social Security system. Following a White House conference in December, the President has proposed to begin bipartisan negotiations with the congressional leaders to devise a comprehensive plan to strengthen the finances of the Social Security system. Now, before I talk about the problems facing Social Security, I want to particularly emphasize how important Social Security is to the lives of Americans and how successful this program has been. For about 60 years now, Social Security has provided Americans with income security in retirement and also protection against loss of family income due to disability or death. A very large share of elderly Americans rely on Social Security as their primary source of pension income in retirement. For example, the average monthly retirement benefit, which amounts to $756, is the major source of income for 2/3 of those over 65 and it is virtually the only source of income for a third of older Americans. Now, Social Security is actually much more than just a pension plan. It's a family protection plan, and 1 in 3 beneficiaries are actually not retirees. It provides survivor's benefits for the average wage earner who dies and leaves a spouse and 2 children that's equivalent to a $322,000 life insurance policy. And it provides disability protection as well. The problems facing Social Security are a natural consequence of the demographic change that's underway in the United States and around the world. Back in 1935, when the Social Security Act was passed, American life expectancy for a person who'd attained the age of 65 was about 12.5 years. Now it's 18.1 years and rising. At the same time, people are retiring earlier, and birth rates have also fallen. And all of that has put us on a path of rapid decline in the number of employed workers for every retired American. In 1960, that ratio was 4.5 to 1. Today, it's 3.3 to 1. In 30 years' time, it will be about 2 to 1 and continuing to fall. Social Security was set up as a pay-as-you-go system, with current workers' payroll tax contributions going to support the income of those in retirement. And clearly, the demographic transition I just described will place strains on the finances of such a system. Right now, payroll tax revenues into Social Security exceed outflows, and the excess is placed in a trust fund which is invested in Treasury securities. However, by 2012, it's expected that outflows will exceed revenues, leading eventually to a decline in trust fund balances, and by 2029, the trust fund will be depleted, leaving insufficient revenues to fund the benefits that are promised under current laws. That is the sense in which there is a problem with Social Security that needs to be fixed. Now, although Social Security suffers from a financial problem, I think public perception has exaggerated the magnitude of the problem, because polls suggest that many young people doubt that Social Security will be there for them at all. However, even if nothing is done, not what I'm proposing, and the trust fund is exhausted, payroll taxes would still be sufficient to permanently finance roughly 75% of benefits. So I would conclude there is a problem, but it's not insurmountable. Many solutions have been proposed to shore up the finances of Social Security, and I think it's too early to judge the possible outcome of what needs to be a national debate and assessment. Even so, the President proposed that not 1 penny of any budget surplus should be touched until a comprehensive solution for Social Security is devised, because those surpluses could play a role in solving the problems of Social Security, and more broadly, they could help the nation prepare for its demographic transition. By way of illustration, every $100 billion of surplus that's transferred to Treasury bonds in the trust fund could delay the exhaustion of the trust fund by about a year. And if the funds were invested instead in equity, which would provide an even higher return, there would be a greater financial benefit to Social Security, although such a move would be controversial and entail somewhat greater risks. There's an added benefit from an economic standpoint of reserving the surpluses, because these surpluses augment national saving and investment, making America's workforce more productive in the future and enlarging the total size of our economic pie, namely our gross domestic product, which is what we will have available in the future to support both workers and retirees. And in the final analysis, a larger economic pie, which results from higher national saving, is really the prerequisite to meeting the retirement costs of retirees without unduly burdening future workers. Let me briefly turn to a discussion now of a very different issue, but also one that will affect our well-being in the 21st century, and that concerns climate change. Scientists have concluded that as a result of human activity, particularly the burning of fossil fuels, concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have already reached levels well above those of pre-industrial times. The ultimate consequence will be a gradual but inexorable warming of the Earth's surface due to the greenhouse effect. If growth in global emissions continue unabated, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide will likely double relative to pre-industrial levels midway through the next century, leading to increases in mean global temperature of between 2 and 6 degrees Fahrenheit in the next 100 years, with further increases thereafter. This poses a significant risk to the world's climate and to human well-being. Some of the potential impacts include a rise in sea levels, a greater frequency of severe weather events, shifts in agricultural growing conditions from changing weather patterns, threats to human health from increased range and incidence of diseases, changes in the availability of fresh water supplies, and damages to ecosystems and biodiversity. In addition, there are risks of large-scale and potentially irreversible events with possibly catastrophic consequences, such as warming of the northern tundra sufficient to release large amounts of methane from the permafrost, leading to accelerated warming, or a possible shift in ocean currents, including a weakening of the Gulf Stream that warms Western Europe. This is the motivation, clearly, for wanting to deal with climate change as an issue. There are two aspects of climate change I'd point to that make it an economic problem and a potentially very challenging one. First, climate change entails a global externality. Emissions of different greenhouse gases anywhere in the world have the identical effect on global climate, and dealing with this externality clearly necessitates cooperation on a global scale. No single country has an incentive to reduce emissions enough to protect the world environment, and every country has an incentive to free ride on the efforts of others. But even if the United States and all the developed countries reduced emissions sharply, greenhouse gas emissions in aggregate would still grow, and it wouldn't help much. By 2030, the emissions of developing countries are expected to surpass those of industrial countries. The second reason climate change is an economic challenge relates to the costs of abating it. There simply has to be a serious effort to contain costs, for without such an effort, the cost of such a project could prove unacceptable. And I think that's where economics can make a large contribution by showing how flexible and market-based mechanisms can be used to bring about greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the cheapest and most efficient ways. Such mechanisms for dealing with externalities, including the use of tradable permit systems to limit emissions of pollutants as an alternative to more costly and more onerous command and control regulations, have proven valuable in a number of circumstances, including limiting emissions of sulfur dioxide that are responsible for acid rain. Such an efficient approach to climate change would involve looking around the globe to reduce emissions wherever they're cheapest. We know that energy efficiency differs dramatically worldwide. The cost of reducing emissions in developing countries like China and India, or in Russia and the former Soviet Union, is far lower than in many developed countries, and that points to the need for global participation and international emissions reduction schemes. Well, what are we doing about this? In Rio de Janeiro in 1992, the industrial countries signed an agreement to limit their emissions to 1990 levels by 2000. but it's clear that this goal won't be met. In fact, emissions levels have continued to rise, not fall. And so to address the lack of progress, the United States and 160 other countries met in Kyoto, Japan last December and reached an agreement that's known as the Kyoto Protocol. What that agreement does, which will require the advice and consent of the Senate, is to place binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions for 38 so-called Annex I countries, which are the industrialized countries defined to include Russia, Ukraine, and the Eastern European countries. The developing countries did not agree to binding limits. The Kyoto Protocol calls for industrial countries to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases to about 5% on average below 1990 levels in the 2008 to 2012 period. This is in many ways a work in progress. Many of the details have not been fully ironed out, and there will be a follow-up meeting next November in Buenos Aires. In addition, the President has made it clear that we need to achieve meaningful developing country participation for the reasons I've indicated before he will submit it to the Senate. Well, let me stop there and say that these two very different issues, Social Security and climate change, are ones where the United States, if it chooses to do so, could just kick the can down the road. And if we don't act, the consequences of our inaction are unlikely to come home to roost in the next decade. But if we do act now, we can minimize the corrective actions that are necessary and also provide households and firms with the kind of advance warning that they need to make adequate preparations.
It's been my experience that people who actually conduct monetary policy prefer to talk about fiscal policy, and those who conduct fiscal policy like talking about monetary policy. That being the case, I want to talk about fiscal policy today. I've handed out a sheet that gives you receipts and expenditures as a percent of nominal GNP, and I hadn't done this for a while. I must say I was a little surprised. Over my working life, basically, the receipts and expenditures, the federal government took about 18% of our total gross national product, and I was a little surprised to see that they're now just above 19. And I hadn't really looked at all of this for some time. During the decades of the 60s to the 80s, there was a continuous process in which they lowered the income taxes and raised the Social Security taxes, and lowered the income taxes and raised the Social Security taxes, but that seems to have stabilized. And given the progressive nature of the individual income tax, is now a rising proportion of our tax receipts. But we do have, as our second largest source of revenue, the Social Security taxes, which are now automated, the ceilings are automated, and the tax base grows with the society. On the expenditure side, again, defense had been 6% of GNP forever and ever, and I once had a general shake a bunch of papers on my nose and say that it was a God-given right of the Defense Department to have 6% of GNP. Yeah. And again, reflecting the rising importance of Social Security, you see that about 11% of our total expenditures are now going for the total Social Security program, including Medicare. Even 97 has a little bit of welfare in it, and that will eventually disappear. But turning back to defense for the minute, it seems as if what this administration is doing is what General Eisenhower did. In the late 50s, General Eisenhower said to the Defense Department, you have $100 billion, and I don't care how you use it, you fight it out. It looks as if the number today is $270 billion, with the Defense Department basically taking their priorities as they go along. But the thing that sort of annoys me is that every time they have a firefight of some sort, the Defense Department comes back for a supplemental appropriation to cover the additional cost of actually using the equipment. And in the post-wall era, when the wall went down 9 years ago, I've heard virtually no discussion of whether we should have a permanent defense establishment or not. I mean, there's nobody out there left to fight on a very large scale. But no one has challenged the fact that we're devoting between 3 and 4% of our total output to defense. And I think that's one of the major things that we should discuss. Or at least we should be discussing what kind of a defense establishment we want, rather than whether, not just whether we have one, but what we want to accomplish and how we're going to pay for it. The third aspect that I find interesting is that this budget is balanced in actually what's considered an overfull employment economy. The deficits in the early 80s were so large that you could no longer use fiscal policy as an instrument of economic policy. Under the Reagan administration, the tax cuts were very high, and we had an increase for 4 years of 14% in defense expenditures. And I'm sorry, but if you cut taxes and raise expenditures at that rate, you get a deficit. And it's a large deficit. At that time, it ran around 2 to 3% of GDP, and the only other country that had deficits of that size were the irresponsible Italians. In addition, these deficits basically doubled the amount of debt that is outstanding, federal government debt, and as a result, we're paying a great deal in interest on that debt. Now, as long as those interest payments are paid to citizens, it's merely a tool for income redistribution, primarily from the general population to the financial institutions. But nonetheless, we've been let with the debt. The politics do not look as if you're going to be able to take the surpluses and pay down the debt. There's more that people want to spend more money on other programs or to cut taxes. So the interest payments, which is a churning operation, seem to be there for quite some time. The other aspect of this is that the federal budget is very, very sensitive to the underlying economy. With a 4.7% unemployment rate, much of the vaunted balance in the budget, both at the federal level and at the state and local budgets, is a result of the economy, not of the efforts of the politicians to restrain the actions going on. I haven't actually figured out the relationship between unemployment and the federal deficit in recent years, but 35 years ago, a 1% rise in the unemployment rate added $25 billion to the deficit, just automatically. First in lost revenue, rising unemployment rates, and although they deny it, unemployment insurance, they don't deny that one, but Social Security is also sensitive to rising levels of unemployment. With an economy which is now 15 times as large as 35 years ago, the cyclical response of the budget to the economy is probably more in the neighborhood of $200 billion. So, have unemployment run 1%, and you've got a deficit of $200 billion right off the bat. Finally, but I fully expect, as it has emerged, that the Republicans and the Democrats are going to continue their fight about what to do with the federal deficit. The Republicans are all in favor of tax cuts, and really, they use tax cuts as a means of limiting the resources available to the federal government and to reduce the interference of the government in the economy. The Democrats seem to be continually interested in expanding the government and not so much raising taxes, but to take any surplus generated by the growing economy and to devote it to what is an amazing amount, a very small amount of all the other things that the government does. Then basically, if you take defense, Social Security, and interest, you have the vast amount of the money that's spent by the government. And I really can't keep my hands off of Social Security. Basically, we had a baby boom, which ran for 1950 to 1964, and then in 1964, and for the next 15 years, the number of live births, not the birth rates, because literally the number of live births dropped very sharply. And so you had, moving through the society, first through the schools, and then through the colleges, and then into the labor force, and now approaching retirement, a bump, and followed by a valley. What's happening now, I think, is very interesting. The baby boomers finally got around to having babies. And my generation, which is the smallest generation in the society, had a completed fertility rate of 3.75 children. The baby boomers, who look as if they're going to come in with a completed fertility rate of under 2, 1.7 to 1.8, are producing the number of live births which are practically equal to the one that my generation produced. And the reason being not because the fertility rate is high, but because there's so many people in the childbearing ages. And so we've got another bump. And those of you who have children and have entering the school system, you're very much aware of this. We're having to open schools, build schools, add schools, and my oldest grandchild, who is 8, is on the wave, the beginning wave of the second baby boom. And fortunately, by 2029, she'll be 40 years old and will be perfectly capable of supporting her parents. So the overwhelming demographic profile that we looked at so unhappily for 15 years is straightening itself out. But the other problems of lengthening age and quality of age and all of these things are still there. And since we haven't looked hard at the Social Security system since the early 30s, actually since 1950, it seems to me that that should be part of the debate as to how we're going to use our resources and how we distribute our income. Thank you.
We're all aware of the remarkably good performance of the macroeconomy. Indeed, if this were the movies, I think I would say at this point, Dorothy, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. We may or may not be in the land of Oz, but clearly we are very close to macroeconomic nirvana, about as close as we have ever been. We were given a very large menu today of things to talk about, and I'm going to do something of a scattershot, make some assertions about a whole range of the topics. I think I'll start off by following what I guess we can call Teeter's Law, which those who have been associated with fiscal policy will talk about monetary policy and vice versa. I'll start off by talking about monetary policy. The first assertion that I would like to make is that the equilibrium or natural rate of unemployment, or if you like, the NAIRU, is a valuable tool for policy making in spite of the fact that it has been drawn into question because of the fall in the unemployment rate below 5%, which was considered below the previous NAIRU. Why do I and why do many others still defend the NAIRU when we've had this gradual decrease in the unemployment rate without any increase in inflation? I think Lyle's going to speak in more detail about this, but let me just give one or two small points. One of which is we've got to have some basic framework within which to start talking about monetary policy, and if you don't have the NAIRU, what do you have? Well, I suppose a couple of things can be suggested, one of which is the old monetarist rule of thumb, and a steady increase in the quantity of money, either M1 or M2. Given the fact that the velocity of money has been quite unstable in the past 20 years. Neither of these is very good. I would in particular point out the problems with the M1, the standard definition of money. M1 has fallen. It's less now than it was in 1994, even though there's been a substantial, obviously there's been a substantial increase in GDP. Just to make my ideological position in the center, having talked about the monetarist approach, I would say something about the alternative Keynesian approach, which I think is, or the old Keynesian approach, which I think is equally unsatisfactory, and that involves making an estimate of the path of real GDP and then aiming for it. Now, the difficulty with this is that it involves both making an estimate of equilibrium unemployment and a whole lot of other things, too, of which perhaps the most important is the increase in productivity. And the difficulty is if you make a mistake there, in particular if you overestimate the path at which you are aiming, this can have very strong inflationary consequences because you can't reach it. And I think this was one of the reasons for the very poor macroeconomic performance of the 1970s, and in particular, the increase in the rate of inflation. The second assertion I want to make is that the NAIRU, even though it's very important, it can change. It is not fixed. Even the earliest proponents of the Nehru recognized that it could change. It could change because of changes, for example, in the age composition of the labor force. But just because it can change, it doesn't mean it's unimportant. I think every economist would argue that the price of wheat, the equilibrium price of wheat, is an important concept, and yet it clearly does not stay stable from year to year. As I interpret history, recent history, there may be another factor, important factor, which is at work changing Nehru. I think that it will tend to be lower if we approach full employment gradually. Now, if that is true, then if the Fed had tried to get to below a 5% unemployment rate very quickly in the previous years, we probably would have set off inflationary pressures which have not been set off by the gradual approach. And again, if this is true, this implies that the stepping on the brakes, which the Fed did in 1994, were really very valuable in slowing down the expansion at that time. The third point I want to make is that one of the reasons for the remarkably strong non-inflationary pressures performance of the economy in recent years has been positive shocks. In particular, the fall of the price of oil by about 30% between the last third quarter of 1997 and the beginning of this year. Some years ago, upward movements in the price of oil were responsible for all sorts of bad things happening. One of the reasons why we've had good performance has been because of those shocks. The fourth point I want to make is that the best level of inflation is not zero. In my opinion, it's somewhere between 1.5% and 2%. Why not zero? I mean, zero is a nice round figure. The answer is that in almost all of the recent expansions, the real short-term interest rate has been negative. I think this has performed a useful function in reducing the magnitude of recessions. Obviously, you can't have a negative real rate of negative real rate of interest if the inflation rate is zero. I guess. One of the questions which was asked for us to address was, should the Fed move to a single target of targeting inflation? And my answer to that is an unambiguous no. The Fed now takes into account not only inflation, which indeed it should be the first thing it takes into account, but it's also, I think, very important for the Federal Reserve, both for economic and political reasons, to take the unemployment rate into account. The next thing I'd like to observe is that it's probably going to be less fun to be a Fed governor in the next 5 years than it has been in the last 5. It's hard to see how it can be as much fun in the next 5 as it has been in the last 5. It's possible, of course, that the Fed may have been really as good as they've seemed, as well as being lucky. One could keep, just a second here while I deal with modern technology. One might keep in mind the statement of football coach Vince Lombardi, his famous comment, you know, it's a funny thing, the harder we work, the luckier we get. The Fed may just have been very good, not so much lucky. To give Mr. Greenspan his due, I think he should be given some real credit for what has happened. And I think in this regard, I should also like to tip my hat to the Clinton administration. I think that their appointments to the Federal Reserve Board have been very strong indeed. A number of the questions which were raised, one of them seemed to have slipped through the cracks when we did our early drafts, was the whole question of East Asia. And I'd like to say just a bit about that, even though I don't consider myself an expert in what's happening in East Asia. The question of what's happening in East Asia, I think, is intertwined with another question, and that is the future of trade policy in the United States. I think that there's some danger that we may have a weak replay of what happened in 1984 and 1985, when we had a very strong United States dollar, a ballooning current account deficit, and therefore pressures on trade policy. And it seems to me that even though I don't think that's going to get as strong as it was in 1985, that in some ways we're, on the political side, less able to deal with that. That is, it seems to me, as I look at what's happening on the political side, that neither of the parties has as strong commitment to free trade as they did 10 years ago, so that there are real problems out there. For those of us who are interested in free trade, I guess the question is, what do we do about it? And I have just one message which I think we need to make over and over and over again. Freer trade is like technological improvement. Freer trade is like technological improvement. If you have freer trade, it may have, in the short run, immediate effects which are positive or negative on the number of people employed. It will tend to create better jobs. It's really peculiar that the government tends to be strongly in favor of technological improvement, and yet, even though there has been, of course, a major movement towards freer trade in the last 50 years, there are all sorts of pressures for the government to put restrictions on international transactions. Well, I see my 10 minutes are up. I've only gotten through a number of the points, but I think I'll leave the rest of them for our later discussion.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting us here on a wonderful day in Atlanta. Second, the organizers also provided to us a long list of issues that we should maybe discuss. And Paul Wonnacott referred to some of these issues. Let me just read you a few of them that they put in front of us. They said, talk about price stability and its implications for Federal Reserve policy. What does that all mean for economic growth? The government surplus, throw in a few remarks about the European monetary system, whether those lessons learned could also be applied to the Americas, and finally deal with global warming, just to keep us feeling warm and fuzzy over here. So let me quickly, in the 10 minutes or 9 minutes remaining, deal with all of these issues. Until yesterday, I would have argued that inflation indeed was very much under control in the United States, and maybe have agreed also with Paul Wonnacott here, who said that basically inflation has been licked. The prices of those goods that we can measure, the price of wheat, the price of steel, and the price of gold, other commodities, have certainly been very, very stable, if not falling, over the last couple of years, and certainly during the last year. It's very difficult to measure other prices of goods like computers. We see the price of computers falling, we see the quality going up, but it's very difficult to come to a precise measurement of how much these prices have actually fallen. And if you turn to the service sector, it gets even more confusing. If you look at medicine, what are we really trying to measure? Are we trying to measure the cost of one day in a hospital? Are we trying to measure the cost of curing one disease? Or are we measuring the cost of maybe preventing one disease by giving one shot and thereby making an expensive medical treatment impossible? And if you look at our own firm, I wouldn't have a clue how to measure whether our prices have gone up or our prices have gone down, because they are so complex. Quality change is constant, and the measurement of prices in the software industry is something exceedingly, exceedingly complex. But I said, until yesterday, I didn't worry about inflation. What were yesterday's headlines in the newspapers? That the government is going to look at the low fares offered by airlines and maybe do something to prevent airlines from offering low fares, so that other airlines can be there that offer even lower fares. Well, the same newspaper also reports that 93% of all people last year flew at a discount rate that averaged around 70%. And now the government wants to make that maybe illegal. I'd rather them worry about the 7% that charge high fares, but I much prefer they don't worry about it at all. Well, what are the implications for this low inflation environment for the Federal Reserve policy? I think the key implication is that you do it very slowly. In the days when we had double-digit inflation, you could actually change the Fed funds rate or the discount rate by 500 basis points or 100 or 200 basis points, a very large amount. Nowadays, you got to change it by 25 basis points if you don't want to spook financial markets. What does that mean for economic growth? First of all, it's not the Federal Reserve's policy to either push economic growth or reduce economic growth, but the Fed's policy really is to keep inflation low or price changes equal to as close to zero as we can get. If you ask any businessman what's the best thing to get economic growth going, to stimulate his own activities, to make it easier for him to hire more people, I think you'll get a unanimous answer, and that is, tell the government to get out of my way and I can move ahead. And I think that's what the government has been doing during the last 2 decades, and that's why we see the high growth rates that we're seeing at the present time. Number 4, what to do about the government surplus, or what to do with the government surplus. I have one straight answer, and that is don't spend it. Whether you want to reduce the deficit or whether you want to lower taxes, give the money back to the people, I think you can argue about that. And the closer you are to full employment, the more probably you have an argument for reducing the debt. As you have some more unemployment in the economy, I think you want to reduce the taxes, give the money back to the people, and therefore put more money into their own pocket so they can spend it on goods and services, which in turn will create jobs for others. The European Monetary Union, a noble experiment. Unfortunately, it's the wrong thing at the wrong time. First of all, it was all conceived with the idea of giving people a uniform means of payment throughout Europe, make it easier to travel around and not to have to exchange money at every border. Well, you really have to change that. All you got to do is plunk down your trusty Visa or MasterCard in Rome, in Paris, in London, wherever you go, and you have a uniform means of payments. The banks will do all the exchange rate calculations for you. I think basically the EMU will lead to the exact opposite of what it is intended to do. A lot of leaders in Europe argue right now that you need a common currency to tie the countries together, to give them greater stability, and thereby reduce the political tensions, make another war impossible. Well, common currency areas do not make wars impossible. The United States had a common currency area and we fought the Civil War. Yugoslavia was a recent example of one country that certainly engaged in a great deal of fighting inside its own borders. There's no political authority behind the European behind the European common currency, and as a result, as soon as unemployment rates, and they're very high in Europe, diverge more and more over the years, who will these national governments blame for their own problems? No easier target than the European Central Bank. And you will see an enormous amount of cross-sniping across the borders in Europe, and that will lead to greater divisiveness than you have at the present time. Also, don't forget that Europe probably has relatively low wage flexibility, and taking away the exchange rate as a possible adjustment mechanism between these countries is certainly not going to help in that regard. In the United States, we can use fiscal policy to change the overall rate of economic activity. Just think what they have to do in Europe. With one common currency, it would be like Georgia, California, Mississippi, every state having its own fiscal policy in the United States translated into our terms. And furthermore, I think it will lead to larger exchange rate swings of all of Europe versus the rest of the world, versus the US dollar, versus the Japanese yen, and so on. What are the implications for the Americas? Should we have a common currency union between the North Northern America and Southern America don't do it. It would be even worse than it is under the European condition, because our economies are vastly more different, the United States versus the Latin American, Central American countries, than even the differences that we see within Europe. And finally, let me close with a few remarks on global warming, only partly tongue-in-cheek. As you probably could tell by my accent, I grew up in Europe. As a matter of fact, I grew up about 20 miles away from the Neanderthal. Neanderthal at one time was the ruling species over the entire world as it was known at that time. About 5 million years ago, at the end of the last ice age, things got warmer. The Neanderthal didn't do too well. He got rid of his bear skins, he got rid of his clubs, and we know the end of that particular story. But the world has been getting warmer ever since the end of the last ice age, ever since the glaciers were extending into Wisconsin and over the entire Midwest. So, another degree or two, will we really be able to turn back world history to the last ice age? That's a difficult question that we have to answer. I don't know whether we will be able to do that. Thank you very much.
All the speakers thus far have sort of spread their comments around among the various questions that we were given. I decided to focus my remarks on just one of them, and that is the new era we live in and the issues it poses for monetary policy. Is the economy behaving differently than it used to? Are we living in a new era? Well, Paul Wanacott said that we're close to economic nirvana now, and I guess that is true. I don't think living Americans have, most of them anyway, have ever had things as good as they are now. Most particularly, inflation is a much less virulent disease than it was throughout most of the post-war period. So the laws of economics have been modified, but have they been repealed? Have traditional ways of thinking about the economy and using the instruments of macroeconomic policy become outmoded? One extreme argument sometimes heard from the proponents of the New Era school is that economic globalism has essentially removed the limits to economic expansion. And because the Federal Reserve doesn't understand this, those Neanderthals over there at the Fed, so the argument goes, it unnecessarily constricts economic expansion. Frankly, I find this argument incomprehensible. The absence of all limits to economic growth would mean that everyone could become infinitely rich, and indeed overnight. I don't suppose anyone really believes that. The limits to growth may be numerically different now than earlier, but the economy's long-term potential growth rate is still determined by the rate of increase of productivity and in the labor force. Another contention of the New Era school is that worries about domestic inflation among policymakers are misplaced, old-fashioned, because if shortages exist at home, the goods can always be imported from abroad. The notion that participation in international trade always acts as a disinflationary force is quite wrong. To see this, imagine a world that's divided into two countries, call them Canada and the U.S. Suppose the monetary policy makers in the U.S. decide to pursue aggressively expansive monetary policies, assuming that any shortages in the U.S. can always be dealt with by importing goods from Canada. And imagine that at the same time, Canadian monetary officials do the same, on the assumption that excess demand in Canada can always be met by importing the goods from the U.S. Well, we're going to have big inflationary problems worldwide in that case, in this hypothetical world. It is quite true that in recent years, participation in global markets has had a strong disinflationary impact on the U.S. economy, but the effect has not always been in that direction, and it may not always be in that direction in the future. A third contention of some New Era advocates, and this is another extreme one, is that there is essentially no limit on how far the unemployment rate can be driven down without generating inflation. Does that mean that the unemployment rate can be pushed down to zero? No country with a market economy has ever recorded zero unemployment. Communist countries used to argue that unemployment didn't exist in the workers' paradise, but no one wants to go to that kind of heaven anymore. The economy's potential growth rate and the full employment-unemployment rate, or NAIRU, are key concepts in the traditional point of view on how the macroeconomy works. They have been key concepts underlying the formulation and implementation of monetary policy for many years. They are useful concepts, however, only if their measurement is not subject to huge amounts of uncertainty. For example, if potential growth can be pinned down to, say, 2 to 3%, and NAIRU is known to be somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5, that's useful information for forecasting inflation and for conducting monetary policy. But if potential growth is between, let's say, 2 and 6, and NAIRU lies between 4 and 8, the traditional view of the macroeconomy is robbed of much of its practical significance. What, in fact, do we know about the economy's growth potential and the full employment-unemployment rate? Well, first, by definition, the economy's potential growth rate is the rate of expansion which leaves the unemployment rate unchanged. That's how we define it. So you can get a rough estimate of potential growth very, very simply. You simply find 2 quarters reasonably far apart in time that have the same unemployment rate, and then you measure the economy's growth rate over that interval. For example, the first quarters of 1990 and 97 both recorded unemployment rates of 5.3%. The growth rate of real GDP over that 7-year interval was 2.1%. So that's a first approximation to potential. In the past 2 years, however, productivity growth has been above expectations, raising the possibility that our long-term growth potential is improving a little. It will be several years before we know for sure, and we won't find out by divine revelation, but by a hard look at the numbers. In the meantime, it behaves a cautious central bank, a prudent monetary authority, not to make incautious assumptions. The best course for the Fed is to assume that the economy's growth potential is somewhere in the range of perhaps 2 to 2.5%, which is in line with most careful estimates. But most new era proponents would argue that we can easily grow at 3% or more or less indefinitely. But if you look at the facts, 3% growth is all that it has taken to reduce the unemployment rate 3 full percentage points since its peak in early 1992. We can't continue to grow at anything close to that rate for much longer without risking serious inflationary problems. Estimating the full employment-unemployment rate is not quite so easy. Careful econometric studies indicate that there's a wide range of uncertainty around any point estimate, as much as perhaps 0.5 percentage point on either side. There's widespread agreement, I think, that the full employment-unemployment rate is lower now than it was in the 1980s, when both wage rates and inflation began to increase when unemployment fell below 6%. In the current expansion, wage rates began to increase, albeit quite gradually, when the unemployment rate fell below 5.5%. Accordingly, recent estimates of NAIRU typically place it at 5.5% or less. It is true, of course, that inflation has continued to moderate despite the rise in wage rates, reflecting a variety of special factors, like the strong productivity gains of the last 2 years that I mentioned a moment ago, declining prices of non-oil imports, the fall in oil prices that Paul mentioned, and moderation in the rise of medical costs. But such special factors cannot indefinitely ward off inflation if wage pressures continue to mount from a persistent labor shortage. And if the Fed were to assume that NAIRU was below the current unemployment rate, it would be running a risky course indeed. So the Fed would be wise to assume, I think, that the full employment-unemployment rate is somewhere maybe in the range of 4.5 to 5.5%. Current estimates of the economy's potential growth rate and NAIRU are, in my judgment, sufficient to make these concepts useful for monetary policy decision-making. But, of course, the estimates of both are less precise than we would like. But are there any real alternatives to their use? One possible alternative that Paul mentioned was reliance on the monetary aggregates. Among them, I would say probably M2 is the best choice. The relation between M2 and nominal GDP appears to have been the most stable and predictable over the past 15, 20 years or so. But the velocity of M2 rose much more in the early 1990s than earlier relations had suggested, and in the past 3 quarters, M2 velocity has been unexpectedly weak. I think we'll see the day when M2 may again become a useful monetary target, but I don't think it's there yet. I would also note that if you want to set the appropriate growth rate of M2 or any other monetary aggregate, you have to know what the economy's potential growth rate is. Otherwise, you'll set the wrong number. Another alternative might be to focus principally on commodity prices to ascertain the appropriate course of monetary policy. That, in my judgment, is not an acceptable alternative to the more traditional approach used by the Fed. Prices of commodities account for only a small fraction of total costs, and they are subject to a variety of special influences that may have little to do with domestic inflation. Movements of commodity prices may signal the appropriate direction of policy when a variety of other indicators are pointing in the same direction. But reliance on commodity prices alone won't do the job. Whether the uncertainties surrounding the numerical estimates of potential growth in NAIRU have created serious problems for monetary policy is best judged, I think, by the economy's performance during recent years. I've been involved in macroeconomic analysis and its implications for monetary policy for more than 4 decades, and I've never seen the economy do as well as it has been in the past few years. The Fed doesn't get all the credit for that, but certainly if the Fed hadn't been following appropriate policies, we wouldn't be where we are now. I conclude, therefore, that the Fed has been able to cope with the uncertainties created by the new era, a new paradigm, and I see no reason for them to shift to a new policy regime.
I want to begin by concentrating a little bit on the current state of the economy as well, but perhaps with a slightly longer perspective. Many of the panelists have already commented on the current recovery or expansion that we've had. The opening remarks, we're in our 8th year of expansion since the last recession. This is actually the 2nd longest peacetime expansion in American history, so it's long by any standards. But what's perhaps striking is the expansion that occurred right before the current one was the 1st longest peacetime expansion in American history. These 2 expansions, the periods between recessions, between business cycles, were separated by a recession in 1990, 1991, which, looking back at it now, is one of the shortest and mildest recessions in U.S. history. So when I look at the current state of the economy, I see something that is historically unprecedented for hundreds of years, and that is 2 back-to-back expansions which are the longest in peacetime in American history, and that is unprecedented. I think the best way to think about this as a macroeconomist, that this is a long boom, 15, 16-year boom in the American economy, and it's quite a bit different in terms of economic stability than anything we've seen in the past. The other thing that's very striking about this period is that the inflation rate has been lower and more stable than at any other time, especially compared to the 1960s and the 1970s, the period of the Great Inflation. So if you look at the macroeconomic situation, the ups and downs in the economy, things in the last 15, 16 years are light years different than they were before. And I would like to ask, what is it about the American economy that has led to this difference? You can look at charts, you can look at statistics. However you cut it, there's a much greater degree of macroeconomic stability, stability of output fluctuation, stability of employment, stability of inflation in this period since roughly 1982. And as I look at it, it seems to me monetary policy deserves nearly the full credit, perhaps even more credit than Lyle Gramley and Paul Wanacott gave it. And the reason I think that is because I'm looking for an explanation that explains the better performance over this 15 or 16-year period compared, say, to the period before that, or the period of the 1970s and late 1960s. And when you look at that, so you see a strikingly different performance for monetary policy. And the thing that I would note, if you look carefully at the data and the statistics, is that the responsiveness of the Federal Reserve, the FOMC, in making decisions about interest rates has been much stronger and much more consistent with respect to focusing on inflation and also with respect to its response to the real economy. In the late 1960s and 1970s, when inflation began to pick up, the Federal Reserve would, as we talk about now, begin to raise interest rates. But those interest rate increases were delayed and small by comparison of the 1980s and 1990s. In fact, they were so small that when inflation began to pick up, the real interest rate would actually decline, adding fuel to the inflationary fire, if you like. In the 1980s, at least since the mid-80s and into the 1990s, that situation has changed. Now, when inflation has picked up, for example, when it picked up a little bit in the late 1980s, at the end of that boom, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, as it has in the past when inflation picked up, but now by larger amounts and quicker, so that the real interest rate, the inflation rate adjusted, the interest rate adjusted for inflation, actually rose when inflation rose. That is a huge difference from the perspective of how we think monetary policy would affect the economy. Now, when inflation begins to rise, the Federal Reserve apparently takes actions to make real interest rates rise, and that takes some of the fire away from inflation. Financial markets have come to expect that, and that has added greater stability to the economy. I believe that this greater stability of inflation that this policy has led to is largely responsible for the greater cyclical stability. Every recession that we've experienced, let's just go back to World War II if you like, has been preceded by a run-up of inflation. Now when people are looking ahead for the next few years and predicting at most a slowdown in the economy, and no one's predicting, very few people are predicting any kind of a recession, certainly not me, and that's because we don't see any pickup of inflation. Things look very benign from the point of view of inflation, but if we did see pickups of inflation, perhaps because of the Department of Transportation's work in the airlines, I can't believe that'll be it, but if we see some increase of inflation, the best guess is the Fed will raise interest rates more, trying to contain that and hopefully be able to. So that's what I see as the big difference with respect to the cyclical performance of the economy in the last 15 or 16 years. It seems to me the implication of this for the future is to try to have a policy in the future similar to what we've had recently with respect to monetary policy. To me, that means focusing a lot of the effort of monetary policy on inflation. People talk about a specific inflation target, as the Bank of England has done. It seems to me it's more important to think about an inflation target, whether it's specific or not, but that really would be the goal of monetary policy. An inflation target of between 1% and 2% seems reasonable, not only for the reasons that Paul Wanakite indicated, but also because of simple measurement error in inflation. There's a positive bias in the measurement of inflation. So 1% to 2% in that region seems to be pretty close to price stability. But I think focusing on inflation, admitting that there's no long-run Phillips curve trade-off, recognizing that there is short-run relationships in the economy which are more complex, would go a long way to bringing about a monetary policy in the future which is similar to what we've had recently. And part of that monetary policy, it seems to me, should be an implicit understanding that increases in inflation will bring about rises in short-term interest rate, the Fed's targets, by large enough amounts to bring about increases in real interest rates, because that seems to be the key feature that I see. Let me now move a little bit to the part of the economy which I think has not been given enough attention yet in this panel, which I think is troublesome. And that is really still the long-term growth rate. In the 1950s and 1960s, the long-term growth rate was much higher than it has been, at least since the mid-1970s. The best way to think about this is in terms of productivity growth. Productivity growth in the 50s and 60s was over 2%, 2 plus, say. In the years since the mid-70s, around 1%, I even think maybe 1 minus, slightly less than 1%, but roughly a 2% to 1% if you want to think of round numbers. Now, the talk about the new economy basically says, well, we're either mismeasuring productivity growth, it's actually higher, all the technology, or the recent pickup in the last year is an indication that things are different, productivity growth is going to be higher. It seems to me, and I agree very much with Log Gramley here, that the evidence really is not in that we've got a pickup in productivity growth to anything like we've seen on a permanent basis that we have in the past. But even if we have had a temporary increase in productivity, it seems to me the focus of economic policy now, broadly speaking, to include fiscal policy and monetary policy, should be to raise our long-term growth rate. I think of it in simple terms. Let's try to have a productivity growth rate of 2% per year for the next 20, 25, 30 years. Numbers we've had in the 1950s and 1960s. That is a very tough goal, but it's a goal, it seems to me, if we focused on for our economic policy, it would go a long way to alleviating many of the problems which are the focus of this panel. For example, an increase in productivity growth on a sustained basis like that, the output per worker hour, would go a long way to alleviating any Social Security problem. In fact, I think growth rates like that would basically eliminate it. Janet Yellen indicated the importance of that in her remarks. But also it seems to me it would go a long way to dealing with what still is a serious income distribution problem, and by some measures still growing and not have improved very much, because it was, after all, in the 1950s and 1960s where we made great strides in improving the income distribution. And I believe that was because of the great productivity growth we saw, which spread throughout the entire workforce, not just certain sections of the workforce. So I think there's enormous importance to focus on long-term economic growth. I like to think about policy as dedicated, therefore, to raising our long-term growth rate. I think a budget policy should be directed that way. But also our education policy. Education reform, especially in K through 12, should be a focus of not only education policy, but economic policy, because it's very important for raising productivity growth. Better trained workers, students who know more about simple mathematics, Algebra 1 is the way I always put it, would make a huge difference in terms of our exploiting these great technological discoveries that we're seeing in the high-tech industry. I think tax reform is still something to focus on. A tax system penalizes saving. Our savings rates are low. Personal savings rates are low. Any kind of tax reform that encourages savings would be beneficial. And regulatory reform. Yes, there's been improvements in regulation with respect to price and entry. The airline's probably one of the best examples. But there's still a great number of regulations and regulations both on the legal side and on the government side that make productivity gains difficult for many firms. And so I think a continued focus on reform of regulations to bolster productivity growth would be very important. But let me just focus on one aspect of these various policies here, because there's really just too many, and that is the budget policy. Because the question about budget policy as it's now been articulated is, what do we do with the projected surpluses? It seems to me, and I would agree very much with Janet Yellen on this, running budget surpluses would add to national saving, and therefore would add to investment, and therefore would be an element in a list of policies aimed to raise our growth rate. You know, I think of the goal, raise growth rate, that is certainly a possible thing to put on the list, running budget surpluses. However, I would be very reluctant to recommend that as a first point of policy. And the reason is, I just think the political system is such that running budget surpluses is nearly an impossibility. So to recommend that as the first point from an economic advisor seems to me to be a mistake. You just see some examples of that right here. Donald Stanton, in his very nice introductory remarks, hinted at the possibility that surpluses would allow more spending in education. It's a very important thing to say, very useful thing to say, especially for those of us involved in education. But it's an example of how surpluses will tend to be spent once they're there. That's the idea. Why not spend a surplus? Even President Clinton's stipulation that we not spend 1 penny of the surplus until we resolve Social Security, as I think Janet Yellen put it, is also symptomatic of the problem. Because if you look carefully at President Clinton's budget, as many people have, you can argue that a lot of the projected surplus is being allocated to spending as it is. It becomes a a budget experts' debate about how much of a surplus is being spent. And as I read the President's President's budget projections, effectively some of the surplus is being spent already. So even there's a debate, and I think that debate makes it difficult to preserve a surplus. And then finally, as Nancy Teeters pointed out, there's some sense in which this projected surplus could be ephemeral. We are in a, most likely, if Lyle Gramley statistics are correct, above full employment. That would suggest that there's a likelihood that if the economy comes back to full employment, that the surpluses will come down. If there's a major slowdown or a recession, of course, we would experience a major reduction in these surpluses. So it seems to me that instead of putting our focus on these ephemeral or politically impossible surpluses, the focus should be on finding other ways to use the budget to raise economic growth. And so what I would look at instead is to find some particular policies that can be put in place that will, once in place, work to raise growth and focus our attention on that. And I'll just give one example of that. And that is the idea of taking our payroll tax, reducing it by a couple of percentage points. So technically speaking, that would be surplus money, but then requiring that that 2% be put in personal savings accounts, which then individuals can invest in the stock market or however they see fit, and to have a little bit of privatization associated with Social Security. That would be taking what would otherwise be government surplus, if we have one, and dedicate it to private saving, stimulating growth in exactly the same way, I think even in a better way, than trying to use these ephemeral surpluses would bring about. So let me leave it there with the focus on, to maybe mention one more time, the importance of economic growth to solve many of our problems. And I think the convenience of focusing all of our policies on raising growth by a simple 1% would make a huge difference. Thank you.
I got my wire hung as I got up from my seat, so I hope you can hear me. I want to thank our 6 speakers for some very provocative comments. If you had asked me before we started if there was any chance at all that we could stay on schedule for the first piece of this, I would have bet my recent gains in the stock market that simply wasn't possible. I hope that the variety of things that the speakers have chosen to talk about is not unnerving to those of you that don't spend your full time in this business of economic policy making. The fact of the matter is that our economy is terribly complex, and at any given time, whether it's an FOMC meeting or a simple debate like today, it's necessary to think about, at the same time, many of these issues, many times cross currents that are pulling in one direction or the other, and try to put it all together to make some sense out of it at the end of the day. After we've taken a short break, we'll come back, and I will try, with, I suspect, an awful lot of help from the panel, to pull and tug at each other and see if we can bring this back to some more logical chunks to talk a little bit more about, so that when we put it together, we may have some better collective sense of where we are. My watch shows 25 minutes after 10. If we could take a 15-minute break and come back at 20 minutes till, that would give us plenty of time for lots of give and take with the panel. Again, thanks to the panel for some great presentations.
Here's our programming schedule. In a moment, we'll continue with the forum you're watching on the U.S. economy and the government's economic policies. After that, Lebanon's Minister of Economy and Trade on the future of his country's economy. Then, 2 journalists discuss the media's coverage of the investigations into President Clinton's personal affairs. Later, presidential advisor Sidney Blumenthal talks about freedom of expression in Latin American countries. Tomorrow on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, Amy Holmes from the Independent Women's Forum will join Bill Messler from The Nation for a review of the stories making headlines in the nation's newspapers. Later, a debate on gun control with Dennis Hannigan, General Counsel for the group Handgun Control, and Larry Pratt from Gun Owners of America. Washington Journal gets underway at 8 a.m. Eastern on our companion network, C-SPAN. Sunday on C-SPAN, former President Gerald Ford takes us on a tour of his museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He discusses some of the new exhibits and talks about his childhood, life in America in the 1970s, Vietnam, Watergate, and his marriage. The 38th president also discusses circumstances leading to the vice presidency and his relationship with Richard Nixon. See it Sunday at 5:45 Eastern, 2:45 Pacific. Now more from Oglethorpe University in Atlanta. Participants in this forum, jointly hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, discuss the state of the U.S. economy and past and present government economic policies. You'll hear from former members of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the President's Council of Economic Advisors, including Janet Yellen, current chair of the President's Council. This portion of the event is an hour and 15 minutes.
Everybody back? I'd like us to get started again, if we can. Thank you all for coming back so promptly so that we can get to what I hope will be the real fun part of the morning, and that is to get some debate and some dialogue going among our panelists. As I said before we took the break, I hope it's not unnerving to those of you that don't do this every day to realize how many different kinds of issues get thrown into the hopper, again, whether it's an FOMC meeting or I suspect a debate among the Council of Economic Advisors. What I thought I would try to do is at least try to see if we can organize our discussion for the next hour or so, 45 minutes at least, into 4 large blocks of issues. A lot of issues, and this is a hodgepodge, a bit of a hodgepodge, and I really wasn't going to start here, but after Nancy Teeter's challenge that people in monetary policy always start with fiscal policy, I refuse to start with fiscal policy, Nancy. I thought we would start with some of the new era, new economic paradigm kinds of issues that some of the panelists touched on. Some claim themselves to be believers. Others, I suspect, may not be. But let's talk about that for a minute. Then we want to talk about some of the fiscal policy issues and our whole range of fiscal policy issues, budget issues that got teased up. I would like to come back and talk about some of the monetary policy issues some more, something close to my heart. And then a block of issues that we didn't spend very much time on during the prepared comments, and that's international issues, everything from the IMF to trade policy, perhaps even some immigration kinds of issues if they don't come out in some of the earlier sessions, and we can come back and talk about global warming as it figures into the international picture. But let's start with the whole concept of a new economic paradigm. I believe both Paul and Lyle declared that they were not believers, that the world had changed all that much. We had a couple of defenses of Nehru, and yet there are a lot of other issues that are at work within this general pot of things that people look at when they talk about a new economic paradigm. And I think John at the end, at least, although I think he suggested he didn't believe in a new era in some of the things he said, I think the very fact that John thinks that we can, in fact, get productivity up to roughly double what it's been in recent years, perhaps squeeze a good bit more growth out of this economy, suggests that somewhere in that mix of things that are going on in this new economic paradigm group of issues, there must be among some of you, at least among John, or with John, some thought that we can, in fact, change the way the world has historically worked, and some of these old issues perhaps need to be thought about in a new light. So let me see if I can get some of you that didn't specifically address the concept of a new paradigm to talk some more about, whether it's the Nehru piece of that, whether it's the productivity piece of it. But is the world really different, or has this simply been a transitory kind of a period that we've been through, and that we in fact will fall back to the more traditional kinds of theories and things that work in this economy? John, you started with your last comments on productivity gains, which I think challenges, the traditional notion, or one of the traditional notions of how this economy has worked for so very long. Do you, in fact, believe that either because of technology or other kinds of things that we can tease an extra 1% out of productivity?
Well, I think we can. I want to emphasize that it's a goal, I think of it as a goal to strive for, and goals are useful for many reasons. Even goals that are not attained are useful for focusing attention, for driving decisions. I think of that goal of raising growth, productivity growth to 2% from 1% is doable by historical standards. You can look back at previous times in U.S. history where productivity growth was that high. So you have a historical precedent that raises the fact that it's possible. And touching on the new economy idea, many people have argued that the technology part, the biotech, the computer technology, the things that we talk about so much and are so visible, are out there ready to be put into place and ready to increase our productivity. So I think that also adds to the possibility that we could do that. But with respect to the fact that we're already there and we don't need to do anything, I think that's a mistake, because we have a very limited information about productivity growth increasing, and that's just in the last year or so. The debates about measurement of productivity are also, I think, very important to take into account. Many people argue that we're not measuring our productivity well because it's occurring in parts of the economy which we can't measure very well. And I think that's a possible rationale for productivity growth already being higher. But I think there's earlier times in U.S. history where technology growth was very high and in areas which it's hard to measure. So it seems to me that's not sufficient reason to think we're in a new era already. And even if we were, we're just getting there, and we better make sure we stay there. That's how I think about it.
Yes. I'd argue we're well into it. I think that the computer revolution is as important as the industrial revolution 150, 200 years ago, and the problems of measurement are being very badly excluded. If you go in and really see what computers do and what they replace, I would guess that our actual productivity is already 1% higher than is being measured. We had to go, I'm prejudiced, obviously, my IBM background, but to get to the declining price on the computer, we almost had to do hand and motion studies in order to do it. And they go in and say, well, you replaced your secretary. But the secretary is now a Neanderthal, basically, and the technology that has been brought into the workforce increases what we do much more than is being measured. And I mean by a very sizable amount at this point. And if you go into a factory, go into a steel mill or something of this sort, there's nobody on the floor. It's all being done from glass houses. And scheduled ahead of time. So I think we're in the midst of a very major revolution in how we operate our lives.
Bob Heller, you come out of the technology industry and may have a different view of whether this is a flash in the pan or whether we've seen enormous investment spending in this business cycle, way beyond anything we've ever seen before. But is it going to dry up? I mean, have we exhausted in many industries the opportunities to squeeze out the kind of productivity gains?
No, we've only just begun. I fully agree with Nancy Teeters, speaking from the hardware side, we from the software side. For instance, take a simple example, small business loans. Until recently, it would take 15 to 20 man-hours to go through the paper to process one small business loan. We have reduced it with our software to 15 minutes. That's a gain in productivity, which is enormous. And we are setting out to use the same kind of decision-making systems that were first introduced in the retail banking sector to apply to other sectors, to the healthcare sector, where we're still in the Stone Age. The productivity increase that you will be able to get out of the healthcare administration alone are enormous. If you look at the mess that you are facing right now in your own personal life, dealing with the health insurance, just think, if it gets straightened out, if it gets as easy as your credit card, that will be an enormous productivity increase. We've only just begun, Jack.
Paul?
I want to separate the question of a measurement error from a policy question. I think that you can make a very good case, and a lot of people have both here and the Boston Commission and so on, that the consumer price index is biased and prices have not risen as much as the measurements show, and that therefore correspondingly with any given change in nominal income we've had a greater increase in productivity. But it seems to me that the implications for monetary policy, if I may talk again about monetary policy, are less than meets the eye. That is, people often go on to say, gee, we can therefore grow faster, implying we should have a more rapid growth of the money stock or something, a more easy monetary policy. But that doesn't follow at all. If we have grown faster than we think we have, the Federal Reserve has already given us faster growth than we think we have. It has no implications at all for monetary policy. Now, it would if you say we've begun the acceleration, that is, there's been some step up in productivity, and the rate of growth is going to increase further because of some momentum. Then there would be implications for policy. But the mismeasurement itself does not make a case for changing policy.
Lyle, you've been watching this for a long time. Are we kidding ourselves? And is this something that's sustainable, or?
Well, I'd like to talk to a different issue,
Okay.
Jack. Whatever productivity has been, it's always a good idea to increase it more. The question is, how do you do this?
Sounds like a central banker here.
The single most important contribution that we could make to better productivity and higher output later on is to increase national saving and hence national investment. And then the issue is, how do we do this? If I believe John Taylor, there's no hope of moving towards a federal budget surplus. That means we have to increase private saving, but we really don't know how to increase private saving. I mean, maybe some changes in the tax system would do it, and maybe they wouldn't. So I'm not prepared, as John is, to give up hope that it's politically unfeasible to run budget surpluses. I think the public is better prepared than their politicians are, and at the moment at least, and maybe politicians can be persuaded to follow what seems to be the public's desire at this point, and that is to pay down some of the national debt.
I want to come right back to that next, but let me give Janet a chance to talk about.
Well, I agree with Lyle's conclusion that whatever is responsible for the disappointing recent behavior of productivity, or at least over the last decade, that we ought to do the right policies, the policies we know can work, can make a contribution to raise it. It has been a mystery, frankly, in spite of libraries full of research, just why productivity growth slowed down. People have expected to see a larger payoff from the computer revolution than they have in fact seen to date. When we look at the productivity statistics, in fact, they're really pretty disappointing. Since 1990, output per man-hour has only increased 1.1%. As we measure it in our statistics. There's been a recent increase in the last couple of years in productivity growth, which is a hopeful sign, but again, I'd agree with others, it's too soon to say that we're in a new era rather than it's being a cyclical phenomenon. But I think we do know what the right things are that we can expect to have a payoff in improving productivity, and they are to save more, increasing private savings or public savings. Public savings, I think we know how to do, and that would be by maintaining the surpluses. With respect to private savings, John mentioned possible tax reforms, and I think there could potentially be a role for tax reform to play in stimulating private saving, but I think the evidence there is weak, and as we get into tax reform discussions, I think it's really quite difficult and complicated to see one's way through to a tax reform that meets the principles one would want to apply to an appropriate tax reform now in the United States. But we can save more, we can invest more in education, we can invest more in technology, and those are the things we know can make a payoff.
Let's use those two comments, Janet's and Lyle's, on the budget and fiscal issues to move to that subject. I suggested in my opening comments that, at least in my mind, better economic policy gets as much of the credit as anything that's been going on in this economy the last few years. I appreciated the nice comments John Taylor made about monetary policy, and we'll come back to that and see if we can convince ourselves that we understand and know what to do about monetary policy. But I suspect that at the margin, the substantial improvement in fiscal policy that we've seen in recent years is one of the most important things that's happened. Now, others may disagree with that, so I guess my base question is, how important in your minds is the fiscal discipline that we have arrived at in recent years as we go forward? How important is that as a fundamental economic kind of an underpinning to this economy? And then from that, we go to the discussions of if we can generate some surpluses, contrary to what Bob suggested, do we dare spend some of it on maybe productivity enhancing kinds of things and other things that are good for the economy? But how should we think about the role of fiscal policy and where we are at the moment and where we've been and where we could drift to as we think about the total economic landscape in terms of policy in this country? Who would like to suggest whether, Nancy?
Well, there are really two pieces to fiscal policy. One is basically, now that we have the deficits within manageable proportions, whether it's plus or minus 1 or 2%, it doesn't, 1%, doesn't matter. But you can use it, which you couldn't do. When the deficits were enormous, you couldn't even do anything with the fiscal policy, and now it's back as an instrument of policy. But on a different basis, and people don't really realize this, that big phone book-sized book is the outline for what the government's going to do. And you've got choices within that. And what surprised me when I looked at the numbers is that we have shifted. And we've shifted away from a defense economy toward an economy that can do other things. And basically, federal policy is a carrot operation. We give you a little bit, and that entices you to put in a little bit more. And I hope we shift toward education and away from income maintenance at that level. But if you look closely at the budget, it is the program for the actual operation of the government, and people should look to see where they're putting their money and what we're getting for them. And more attention should be paid to how that money is spent.
How serious a problem have we created for ourselves if the combination of the urge to spend on good things and maybe in other people's minds not so good things comes at the same time the economy slows, if that should happen, or when that happens?
Well, if the economy slows, you're going to have an automatic deficit. Don't worry about it.
How important is it to maintain something close to a balance?
Well,
as opposed to going back to the level of deficits that we've experienced and not so many years ago.
You don't want to do what was done in the early 1930s when the economy slowed down and they started cutting the government in order to try to balance the budget. A cyclical deficit is part of the automatic stimulus system, and we should use it. We shouldn't try to offset it. But in the terms of full employment, we have choices on how we collect our revenue, and we have choices on how we spend the revenue, and people should become focused on that.
Other general thoughts on fiscal policy and life?
I have a rather strange comment to make from an economist who was once a member of a Democratic Council of Economic Advisors. Most such people have nothing but bad things to say about the Reagan Revolution. The Reagan Revolution didn't provide any increase in our economic growth rate. If you measure it properly, it didn't increase the rate of job gains. What it did do was leave us with a huge deficit. But that had one rather favorable effect, I think, and that was the deficit was so bad that we stopped using fiscal policy as a tool to try to tune the economy in the short term, which we tried to do in the Carter administration, much to my great chagrin, looking back on it. And what we have in effect now done is to rule out fiscal policy as a short-term stabilizer, and we're focusing, I think on what we should be focusing on. What are our long-run goals, and where should we go with fiscal policy?
Yeah. It seems to me, first I'd certainly agree with Nancy that we should not try, if we do have the bad luck to fall into a recession, to try to cut the deficit to maintain a forever balanced budget. I think that we should, in deciding what's an appropriate long-run stance of fiscal policy, regard budget surpluses as a portion of national saving and ask what should national saving be from an economic standpoint. Now, we have raised national saving very significantly since 1993 by getting rid of those budget deficits. In spite of the fact private saving has fallen, we can see what the payoff is. The payoff has been a huge surge in investment. We've had investment proceeding growing at over 10% a year in real terms, and we've had over the last few years the greatest growth since, I believe, 1969 in industrial capacity that we've ever seen. This is something that clearly stimulates growth, and I think it's also holding inflation down. The question from judging fiscal policy over the longer term is, what is the payoff to saving more? Is it worth the sacrifice of not using those surpluses for some other spending or tax cut reason? And it seems to me that by many metrics, the payoff to saving is sufficiently high, particularly given the demographic transition this country is going to undergo, that there is a good reason to argue for greater savings.
Talking about the budget, first of all, basically it was the mechanism put in place during the Bush administration that has resulted in greater fiscal discipline, where Congress consciously has to make trade-offs between what they want to spend their money on, that has resulted, I think, in the current budget balance that we are enjoying at the present time. But Lyle Gramley asked the question, how are we going to get savings even higher than we have it at the present time? And at the present time, it's very low. One very simple thing to do is, for instance, to stop the double taxation of dividends. Company earnings get taxed, first of all, at a rate in excess of 40%, and then again we tax the dividends at the individual level. If you want to do something to encourage savings, stop an investment, stop that double taxation, and shift more of the taxation on consumption rather than on saving and investment.
Yeah.
A couple of things on this. First, the investment boom has, to a large extent, been financed by overseas lenders and investors in the United States. And that in itself, in my view, is not a problem. But it does remind us that the savings in the United States, national savings by Americans, is well below the investment opportunities here. So I think that if we could close that gap, maybe even healthy ultimately for trade policy, that'd be another reason to raise our savings rates. And I think in order to raise them, we need to focus on private saving. The other thing I would like to mention is that in Nancy Teeter's helpful chart, it does remind us that receipts by the federal government as a share of GDP are really at an all-time high. And I think from the perspective of the gains that we've been able to have in defense spending is really a third as much now as it was in 1960 as a share of GDP. It seems to me that at least indicates that some adjustment on the tax side is relevant in terms of keeping the size of government at a reasonable rate. These are issues that we need to debate in a political environment, and many people have different views, but it seems to me the facts that tax receipts are as high as they've ever been is a factor to take into account in judging what future tax policy should be.
I want to get a little bit of time in on monetary policy and international issues. I'm almost afraid to start, the Social Security piece of federal spending, but Janet teed that issue up nicely for us in her opening remarks, and I guess I would just ask a general question. Given the fact that our current budget surplus estimate of $8 billion, or whatever estimate you want to put on it, is only a drop in the bucket compared to the $2.5 trillion hole that people are talking about that we have in Social Security. What's your confidence level? What's our collective confidence level that Congress, at the end of some broad public debate, will in fact find a way to deal with the Social Security issue without huge, massive increases in federal spending? Give some others a chance, Janet. I don't know whether others have, I mean, this is a major issue of the day that has great economic consequences, and we ought to take a few minutes to get some other views on it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we have an opportunity to make some changes in Social Security over the near term, and I think one issue, one suggestion that I hear a lot about increasing is some effort to begin to privatize part of Social Security. And that's the suggestion in my open remarks that has been discussed and proposed by a number of people already, would be to take, say, 2% or some fraction of the payroll tax, reduce the tax by that amount, and have individuals contribute that to their own personal savings account. I think is something it's much more likely, I would say it's much more likely now than I would have said a year ago. So I think that's healthy. But I would also just say it seems to me that from the point of view of really making a difference for Social Security, our growth rate makes a tremendous difference. I mean, you could if we get the goal that I put forth achieved, all these problems would go away.
Let me see if others have quick thoughts on the Social Security issue before we...
Well, one of the interesting things is that the baby boom, which has caused us all these problems of worrying about how they're going to retire and so forth, partially the demographics are correcting themselves at the present time. But second, that those baby boomers are on the verge of going into, on a life cycle basis, the highest rate of savings of their entire lifetime. I mean, once you get your kids through college, that alone, I mean, once the final child is through college, it's the biggest tax cut we ever had in our life in terms of the disposable income. So as they come into their 50s and so forth, you're going to see a rise in individual savings for that particular age group. Now, the other thing that has not been really talked about very much is that when my generation dies, and my children are all baby boomers, there's going to be the largest transfer of private wealth that has ever occurred in the history of the world. We have the highest home ownership in the world, and we're passing down to our children a asset base that is just enormous, and nobody's really taking a look at it. I don't even have any idea how big it is. So there are other things coming in here than just the payroll tax and on down the line. And I see now, as the demographics is straightened out, that the Social Security problem is diminishing, and that it's a problem of timing. And there's nothing that's God-given about paying for with payroll taxes. You could actually divert some of the other funds into the support of the Social Security system if it is a temporary timing problem.
This could take us far afield, I can tell, by just reflecting on that myself. I want to get some time in on monetary policy, obviously, very close to my heart. I think that many people, and I have to include myself, have been happily surprised at the fact we've kept inflation in the range we have for such a long period of time now. I think John Taylor expressed the view, I don't think he suggested it was licked forever, but I'm hearing more and more from people that there's a growing confidence that the Federal Reserve is committed to a low inflation environment, given, I think, things we can point to that suggest there's a great dividend from that. But absent some kind of an inflation target, which many people have advocated, not so much recently with inflation low, but certainly earlier, and we've seen other central banks around the world move to a more explicit inflation target as opposed to the mixed basket of objectives we have today. Is it realistic to expect that we, in fact, and others that will sit at the FOMC table, in years to come, will be able to follow the kind of monetary policies that will give us the greatest chance of keeping inflation in this range? Or should we be debating more seriously the notion of some kind of an inflation target to keep that issue in our face, on the table, as something to rally around? A couple of people have touched that in their remarks, but let me open it up to the broader group in terms of whether that's an issue that should still be alive and be part of the public debate.
You ask a question of what the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee will do, and all I would say is that's what you guys are chosen for, so I hope you do.
I accept that.
Clearly, I think that keeping the inflation rate down below 2%, or certainly not much above it, is extremely important. And I would expect that, given what happened in the 1970s, which left us such a hangover, that people would recognize that short-term inflation has really huge long-term costs.
Paul, you're saying that even under our current Humphrey-Hawkins legislation and without a more explicit inflation objective, you think that there's a high probability that we can...
See, I don't think you need to write these things into... I don't think you need to write these things into law. It depends on who you appoint to the Open Market Committee. And I would just hope that the lessons of the 70s don't fade in the Open Market Committee in the next 20 years. I would think that they would not, but that strikes me as the question.
Okay, right. Would others have a different view in terms of the potential value of some kind of a more explicit target?
Just very briefly, first of all, the Fed can chase only one rabbit at a time. Humphrey-Hawkins tells the Federal Reserve to chase several rabbits at the same time, and therefore I think it's appropriate to replace that legislation by a clear inflation targeting legislation that clarifies the mandate of the Federal Reserve. In the current situation, I think the Federal Reserve has to tread a very narrow path, because just like the danger of inflation is there, there's also the danger of deflation. The current recession in Japan, while they have many structural problems in Japan, but the current recession was triggered by the Bank of Japan pursuing a very tight monetary policy, which actually led to a deflation. And once you're in a deflationary environment, where prices are actually falling all over the place, it's very difficult to get that process, the process of economic growth, started again. As the old saying goes, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. So at the current time, I think the Fed, well, it has to have one eye out for additional inflationary pressures. It also got to beware of the potential danger of deflationary pressures.
I want to come back to that in just a second, if I can. Would others have a view? Lyle.
It seems to me that the Fed recognizes, everybody recognizes, that the payoff for price stability is a lot greater than almost anybody recognized in the 1970s. In the 1970s, Milton Friedman and a few lonely souls were telling everybody that the world would be a much nicer place if we had price stability. But no one really believed that. But we've gone through enough time now, and we've seen the results of price stability to recognize that this is a very desirable state of affairs. So I don't think the Fed would ever go back voluntarily to the pursuit of the kinds of policies it did in the 1970s. The question is, will the politicians stay off their backs? And I think one can make a case that it isn't that the Humphrey-Hawkins legislation is screwing up the Fed's operation. I mean, Humphrey-Hawkins is essentially irrelevant. But would the Fed be better off in fighting off politicians if they had some sort of a mandate which set up price stability as the sole goal? And I think the answer would be yes, if that legislation were written which recognized, A, that there are short-run trade-offs between unemployment and inflation, and B, that you can get off track for one reason or another, and you need time to get back.
You dare?
Well, it's been long-standing tradition of the Clinton administration
Not to help with monetary policy?
Not to get involved in monetary policy and not to comment on it. And so I'm leery to even say anything about this. But I guess I would simply say that clearly there is a payoff to having low inflation. I agree with Paul and others. There is a danger in pushing that too far, especially given biases in the price indices. We can see what happens now in a country like Japan, where they're on the verge of deflation. Interest rates, short-term interest rates, have been lowered to 0.5%, and real interest rates have no ability at this point to go negative because inflation is simply so low. So I think there is a danger from an inflation target that is too low, although low inflation is clearly good. I guess I would think, you asked the question, should there be an explicit price target? It seems to me there is an advantage to having the Federal Reserve follow policies which are understandable, which embody a strategy that the public and the private sector can readily understand. I think it enhances the Fed's credibility. I don't think it needs to be a rigid inflation target supported by a very rigid rule. It seems to me the Fed can focus both on price stability and ironing out short-term fluctuations, as it always has. And I think John's work shows that paying attention to both inflation and unemployment, focusing on both things, is a good description of what the Fed has done. But I think being clear, and I think the Fed's moved in this direction, about what its strategy is, how it thinks about the world to help guide private decision-making, is certainly worthwhile.
That's a good comment. Appreciate that. Paul.
In terms of reinforcing the argument against too explicit an inflation target, one problem, of course, is if you start talking about an inflation target, somebody's going to mention zero, and it's going to be a real major political problem how you deal with that. A second observation I would make is that I think that the European experience of the last 5 years does not give us much reason to cheer what seems to be an almost exclusive attention paid to an inflation target. There are, of course, all sorts of major structural problems in the European labor markets, but I find it hard to believe that the natural rate of unemployment in France is 12%.
Yeah, John.
I think it is very important to have an inflation target of some form. For example, if each member of the FOMC articulated a view, their own view, I think the president of the New York Fed did this at one point, that we think a desirable level of inflation would be, say, between 1% and 2%. It doesn't have to be passed into law, but if that were a stated view, I think that would be helpful. It would be more in terms of clarification. I also think that some sense that the Fed just really can't affect the unemployment rate or the real growth rate in the long run is a sensible thing to articulate. The short-run trade-off is very hard to describe and talk about with people, and I think that's why it's probably correct for most central bankers to shy away from describing it, because it's very hard to describe. But on a technical basis, I think staff and other people who communicate with the financial markets should be doing as much as possible to communicate those technical details.
Let's take 2 minutes on the natural follow-on question to this last discussion. I think Janet and Bob have already tipped their hand how they would answer this, but you know, until recently, there were a number of voices that were crying for an inflation target, explicit or otherwise, much closer to zero. And there's still a few voices that would have us try to push inflation still a bit lower. My own judgment is there's not much constituency at the moment for that, given the measurement errors that I think a couple of people have commented on. But should we, in fact, should that debate also still be held? And is there still an issue with regard to whether 2%, 2.5% that we have been experiencing in recent times is an acceptable definition of price stability? Or should we, in fact, be trying to look for opportunities to nudge it down a bit further?
Well, if there is an error in the measurement, nudging it down further, it's actually depressing. I mean, it's deflationary.
Depressing to you personally, or potentially, potentially deflationary?
It's deflationary. I mean, if there's an error in the study. But if you look at what we actually use the CPI for, we use it to adjust the Social Security benefits. And if it's overstated, essentially what we're doing is transferring some of our increase in real income to the retired population. And I don't really object to that. I think, since I'm retired, obviously. But nonetheless, I mean, if you had a perfect measure and you gave them only price increases, then the retired population would be frozen at the level of real income that they had when they retired. And I don't object to doing that. I've never really objected to Social Security because without it, my mother, my mother-in-law, and my aunt would have lived with us, and they're all three very nice people, but together, it would be impossible.
Is there anyone on the panel that would argue that the current level of inflation is still not as low as would be optimum?
Okay, can I ask you, what is the current level? How would you say the current level? What is it?
Well, this is not
3%, 2%.
This is not fair to turn the tables on the moderator.
I would say if you think it's 3%, I think that's too high. I think we should try to get it lower. But if it's 2%, we're getting very close. I think 1% to 2% is the range. That's basically the estimate of measurement error. That's effectively zero. But it's also very important to think about the lower bound. I think if you let the inflation rate go too low, and I think that's what happened in Japan, it went negative. And that is historically very problematic. And I think all those stops should be taken to prevent deflation at this point, based on history, based on what we know about how the economy works. And the value of an inflation target comes in at the bottom as well as at the top.
I hear a great... Yeah,
one very quick comment. If you look at the various measures of price stability, obviously, and if you look at producer prices, they are already at zero. And there we do not have the measurement problems that we have in the consumer price index. So I think that sort of further reinforces the thought that, 1% to 2% price range for the CPI, a zero price change for the PPI, for the producer price index, that's a world that we can live with.
And I believe you're arguing that because of measurement problems of the inflation in services, which is the higher piece of the inflation measure may in fact not be as high as reported, given the measurement problem. So let's get a few minutes, before we open it up to the audience, let's get a few minutes in on some of the international issues. And I'm not sure how to try to frame what I hope we could talk about there. Clearly, the Asian situation has raised a number of issues. I mean, it can be viewed either as a negative demand shock or a positive supply shock, I guess, depending on how one chooses to view it. One of the things that I hear over and over again as I talk to real business people is that there are enormous pressure to maintain current pricing. Pricing behavior is very different. Businesses of almost any kind can't get price increases. They continue to tell us that. And the explanation I get more often than not is not only domestic competition, but now the new dimension of international competition. I was among those that were disappointed that with the trade discussions didn't go any further than they did last fall and early part of this year. And how important is this international trade issue in terms of our domestic economy, and how important is it to continue to work to get additional trade agreements and expansion of free trade in terms of what that means to the U.S. economy? Is that an issue that needs some more discussion?
Well, I think you need to distinguish between the disinflationary effects and the effects on efficiency and output. And others know more about international trade than I do, but on the disinflationary aspects, the reason there's so much disinflationary impact right now is twofold. One is we've had an increase of on the order of 25% in the value of the dollar since the spring of 1995, and the other is we've got a tremendous amount of excess capacity abroad, both in industrial countries and more recently in Southeast Asia. That's a more or less temporary situation kind of thing. Free trade is not, you don't advocate free trade because of inflationary implications. You advocate it because of the implications for efficiency.
Bob, you've spent a lot of your life in the international arena. Have you got a special sense about some of these international issues of the moment that...
Well, clearly it's a much more global economy than we ever had before. That goes without saying. You have very free international capital flows. That helps as far as the global resource distribution is concerned. True trade barriers, I think, are few and far in between of a major magnitude. We have gone through so many rounds of tariff reductions that tariffs are really not a major obstacle. It's difficult, obviously, to get into foreign markets, but those are often institutional problems, and you know, it takes a long time to break into a domestic market where people are familiar with their own suppliers and so on, and that is a bigger problem. I think American industry got to redouble their efforts to get into these foreign markets in a proactive way. I don't see obstacles that can be negotiated away that would make a fundamental difference in the way we could conduct business. That work has been done.
Janet?
It seems to me that trade is, throughout the 20th century, been one of the most important world forces for growth. And I think Paul got it exactly right in his opening statement. You indicated that one way to think about trade is like it's a new technology. It is. It's something that enhances real income, just like a technological breakthrough would. And it raises competition. It opens up the United States and other countries to competition from world markets. In addition to holding inflation down, what it does is it forces businesses to be on their toes and to innovate, to stay up with their rivals. One of the forces for growth that should have been in our list was, along with saving and education, is open markets and increased competition. And there is even new thinking now among economists that suggests that the force of trade could even result in a permanently higher growth rate through the dynamic of openness to competition, raising the rate of innovation. When I think about the Asian crisis, I think one of the dangers we have to be careful about is the protectionist danger that lurks in this crisis, both in Asia, where their difficulties, the inability now to sustain capital inflows, can move them if we're not careful in a protectionist direction. And I think one of the important aspects of the approach the United States and the IMF is taking is to encourage those countries not to shut themselves off from world markets, either trade or capital markets, because in the long run that's important for growth. And I think we face a problem here in the United States as well, because I think we will see, because of the Asian crisis, and I believe, Paul, you mentioned this, that this harkens back to 1984 and 85, we will see an increase in our trade deficit. We will see an increase in our current account deficit. And there will be some adjustments that go with that. We have a very strong economy. I think we can keep growing through it, but we will hear cries for protectionist measures of various sorts. I think they need to be resisted.
And we're already hearing some of that, even with the current level of...
You know, I don't think the stock market crash of 1929 was what triggered the Depression. I think it was the Smoot-Hawley Act, which went in 1930, and it literally halted international trade with retaliations that came back, and we spent the next 50, 60 years breaking down those things that came in. And from a point of view of the consumer, the international trade has done more to increase the value of consumer goods than anything else that could have occurred. If we hadn't had the Japanese and German cars, think what really crummy cars we would be driving without that competition.
What about those Japanese computers?
Oh, that's a different...
Let's get just a minute, before we open it up to the audience, let's get just a minute in on the IMF's role in the world as having been tested most recently, and lots of discussion in Congress and elsewhere among lots of people about whether the IMF meets the need of some kind of a global central bank to be the lender of last resort in the world. And there were a couple of comments in your formal, prepared comments on the Asian situation, and I believe at least one on the IMF, but would others have comments they would like to share about the way the IMF mechanism has worked and what that most recent experience says about dealing with those kinds of global financial crises that will surely come again in our lifetime?
Yes, I'm quite uncomfortable with the way that the IMF has moved in recent years to go beyond, quite a bit beyond its original scope, which was really to help maintain a fixed exchange rate system in Bretton Woods. And it's a very large bureaucracy, which I think, like many bureaucracies, tends to be more secretive than it needs to be, less open than it needs to be. And it's a lot of the ways it's using that power are troublesome to me. For example, the stipulations in some of these agreements that countries do things which may or may not be good economics, frequently are good economics, but stipulating it as part of a loan package which the stipulations have very little to do with the short-run problem at hand, for example, in trade policy. So I'm quite uncomfortable. I think a much greater openness is very important for the IMF. I think even reducing its mandate or defining its mandate would be very important, because right now you can make the argument that things like moral hazard and the lack of accountability at the IMF could be causing more problems than it's actually solving.
Bob?
Well, having worked at the IMF, just to show my bias, I think it does a lot more good than bad overall in the world economy. If the IMF would not exist, there wouldn't be a forum for policy discussion in the first place, where virtually all the world's countries are represented around the table. That's a very important safety valve, leads to more rational discussion, avoids very irrational policies. And overall, I think the IMF has done pretty good. Also good, even viewed from a purely parochial standpoint of the United States, because a lot of the money that we make available through the IMF is leveraged many times over by the contributions and also of other countries. I agree with John that it could be a much more open institution, more open deliberations, And that's a goal, I think, that we can work towards. But as an institution, it should not be abolished. It's done a good job for the world economy in the last 50 years.
Janet?
Well, I would agree with Bob. This year's Nobel Prize winner in economics, Robert Merton, has said that global capital markets are like superhighways. They get you where you want to go very rapidly, but when crashes occur, they can be dramatic. And I think when you look at the world economy, open capital markets have been very important as a mechanism for development, and I think nowhere is that clearer than in East Asia, where we see the crisis. But when there's a loss of confidence, and there are reasons, there are underlying structural problems there, when you have a loss of confidence and capital outflows, the consequences can be very dramatic. And while there are problems of moral hazard in having a lender of last resort, there are also tremendous benefits. We have a situation where there's enormous risk of contagion, and we've seen contagion in the Asian crisis. And it seems to me that on balance, the IMF is the right organization to work to provide temporary financial assistance while countries are putting appropriate reform programs into place to try to restore that confidence and try to get those economies back on track. That there's pain associated with the programs that the IMF has recommended, but the greatest pain for those countries really comes from the loss of confidence and the loss of access to capital markets. And yes, I think I'd support greater openness at the IMF, as John recommended, but on balance, I think it has the expertise, it has the credibility, it has the international support, it has the ability to put into place appropriate conditionality and to play a stopgap role.
I've got lots more questions on my page of notes here, but let's open it up to the audience and see what kinds of things that you might want to ask the panel about. We've got microphones on the side if you don't mind coming. If that keeps anybody from speaking up, you can stand up and shout, but it would probably make it easier for everyone if you would walk to the microphone. Yes, sir, in the middle. And if others have got, come on down to the microphone if you've got things you'd like to pose to individual panel members or the group as a whole to see who will pick it up and respond to it. It's a great chance to ask. Yes?
I'd like to ask where the panel thinks we're going with Glass-Steagall. Legislative change, regulatory relaxation, or both, and is that good or bad?
A great issue given the events of the last couple of days. Who would like to pick that up?
Hasn't it already just vanished by being ignored? That's sort of, I don't know that we'd ever repeal it, but essentially the relaxation of the relaxation of the rules against interstate banking have essentially just removed it.
Well, certainly, if the Citibank merger goes through, then you have a combination of Solomon, Smith Barney, Citibank, and then effectively Nancy Teeters is right. But I would vastly prefer that Congress would get around to actually repealing it so that instead of legal loopholes being used all the time, we would have a clear a clear charter for financial institutions in this country.
Anyone else like to comment? We've got lots of other questions. Let's go to the other side and take one.
I have a question for Mr. Heller, and I'd like to open it up to the panel as well, about European Monetary Union. Mr. Heller, you said that you thought that the EMU project would lead to the opposite of what is intended, but I would submit to you that part of the intention, as I'm sure you're aware of the project, is to make labor and goods markets more flexible, to create a large and liquid capital market. Europe will have the second largest bond market in the world, for example, and to force countries in Europe to bring their fiscal policies into a more healthy state. Also, you have a European Central Bank with a very clear stability-oriented mandate, to maintain stable prices. I'm just wondering if you could tell us, you're saying You see a lot of difficulties there. In 3 weeks' time, there will be the decision to go ahead with it. It's virtual certainty now. It'll start in January 1999. What is your prediction for the scenario? Is EMU going to break up? And I'd also like to ask the panelists if they agree with Mr. Heller. Is it the wrong thing at the wrong time? I mean, maybe you can give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Thanks.
I agree with you that they will go ahead. Not everything government does is itself a good idea. I think for the first 2 or 3 years there will be some euphoria that will carry the day. Then when the first couple of rounds of national elections are being fought throughout Europe, and if the unemployment rates are in the double-digit ranges, as they are right now, there's so no reason that they will come down drastically because of the structural problems that these countries have at the present time. Individual governments will be blaming the European central banks for all their problems, and there's no political arena where the conflicts can be resolved. There is no European government. There's no European fiscal authority. So to put it all on the monetary authority, put a straitjacket on there, that is, I think, going to lead to enormous political pressures, and as a result, you will see a lot of discord and potential dislocation.
See.
I just want to say one thing about this. It seems to me it's going through, so we have to maybe make suggestions about how it might go through smoothly. And I think I agree with many of Bob's worries, but one way to reduce those worries would be for the European Central Bank to put a monetary policy in place similar to the Federal Reserve's, which has worked so well. And I think that's really a constructive way to think about how they run monetary policy. If it could be explained and conducted that there's going to be a European Central Bank, how it's going to be operating differently from the Bundesbank, I think that'd go a long way to relieving some of your problems.
Anyone else like to add? We have other questions in the wings. Yes.
One rather specific argument for monetary union. I see some of the problems with it, but if you have monetary union, of course, you lose sizable control over your own domestic macroeconomic policies. One of the more enthusiastic countries about monetary union, of course, has been Italy. I think if I lived in Italy, I would think that there might be something to be said for losing control of your macroeconomic policy.
With that, let's take another question from my left, your right.
I recently did a survey of about 25 Wall Street types, and the question I asked them was, apart from companies trying to fix the problem, can you name any public companies that are out of the woods as far as this year 2000 computer problem is concerned? They would only go, most of them wouldn't go on the record. I came up with a list from them of only 8 companies, 7 of which were banks, and 1 was Merrill Lynch. The other was Merrill Lynch. And the analyst said that even those companies would have to put moats around themselves to keep bad data from corrupting their good data. Is this situation as serious as it's being described? And before I finish, I understand that the EMU, which comes on stream in January of 1999, may have severe computer dislocation diseases attached to it as well.
The problem's being worked on every level, as near as I can figure out, and the difficulty of correcting it depends on how old your programs are. In the case of Inland Steel, we have a totally new computer program in place, and so we wrote it doesn't exist. All right. If you have a whole bunch of old programs that haven't been reviewed or documented for some time, you got a problem, because you're going to have to go in and find every piece of it as it goes along. Most institutions that I'm associated with are hoping to have the problem solved as of December 31st, 1998, so that they can spend a year testing it. Now, there's going to be some glitches, but everybody's aware of it. And so it's a matter of getting the technical expertise in to find the places in the programming where those instructions occur. And I'm sure some people are going to miss.
Bob, you just came from a company with, not too long ago, with a huge investment in technology, and you're still very much part of that industry, so.
Well, the problem is enormous, and the expenditure at the current time for fixing these programs is enormous. You have heard a lot of words about productivity increases. At the present time, if you are trying to install a new computer program at any major corporation, the answer is basically it can't be done. And that will have implications for the current growth rate. It can't be done because every single computer programmer that they have is currently occupied on fixing the Y2000 problem, and in Europe it's twice that bad because they also got to get ready for the EMU conversion.
Others with comments on the level of concern or should be concerned.
My impression is that probably 90 to 95% of American businesses and financial institutions will have dealt with the problem in a timely way. What is not so clear is what's going to happen in areas like Europe, Latin America, and Asia. And most of the problems I think that our businesses are going to encounter is because of their tie-ups with foreign companies.
Well, is anyone else on the panel that wrote computer programs early in their career? Some of mine may still be running out there. I hope they've been fixed if they're still there.
You know, my secret solution is to hire only Israeli programmers because they're already in the year 4000 something.
Well, with that, we will take the next question. Yes,
I have two questions related. One is the ever-increasing percent of our GDP going to medical costs in this country. I've heard as high as 15, 17%, where the closest countries are Japan with 11 and Europe 7 and 8. So as this amount of our wealth goes to health costs in total, what are we doing to become much more efficient or productive or whatever in that area? The second we've heard mentioned a couple of times is a consumer price index, and one of the reasons to slow it down, at least get a better estimate, is to hold down the costs for subsidies for Social Security recipients and so forth. My father-in-law, who is one of those, says that this is highly distorted because their cash outputs goes to drugs and things like that, which have been increasing significantly faster than the CPI in total. So we are actually, if we want to help them out, we are distorting them out by using a CPI that is broad-based instead of related to them. Thank you.
I believe the question would have to do with the trend in medical costs. I assume we can leave Social Security aside and just talk about the underlying trend in medical costs that have been so favorable in recent years. Is that an area of potential cost pressures in the period ahead? Anybody feel like they have some insight into...
Can we answer that in one word? Yes.
It's okay with me.
No, let me... The whole medical care issue is of course extremely important and extremely complicated. Let me make I was sort of determined when I came here not to make too many political comments, but I think one of the things that's really been unfortunate with the first Clinton administration is that they addressed something which I think was very important to address, and for all sorts of reasons I think it's made it more difficult to address it in a timely way. Having said some things which are perhaps on the edge of being politically difficult, let me really put my foot into it. And it seems to me that one of the things which we're not capable of dealing with adequately in our society is this whole problem of heroic measures for people who are terminally ill. And I think other societies, Britain for example, have dealt with them in what strikes me as a much more reasonable way, although it would not be acceptable for an American, in an American context. But I think that's going to be a continuing problem, and I don't see how we get out of it.
If I could express the same point that Paul did and put it in a somewhat broader context. As economists, we're well aware of the fact that prices do a wonderful rationing job. If you can pay for it and you want to buy it, you do. If you can't pay for it, you don't. In medical care, we're not prepared to accept that solution, And therefore, something else has to do the rationing. And we, as a nation, have to get serious about discussing openly and candidly, how do we ration medical services if we're not going to use price? Until we do that, we're going to continue to flounder.
Jay.
I would just add, I agree, it's an enormously complex question how we put in place an acceptable system to control costs. And in a sense, we focused on Social Security this morning because it's the easiest demographic problem to deal with. It's one we can say is clearly surmountable. I think Medicare and Medicaid, frankly, as we look at demographic projections, unless we are able to get health costs under control, really pose a larger fiscal threat to the United States and to the federal budget than Social Security, which we're focused on. There is a Medicare Commission that was set up by the Balanced Budget Act. It's just convened, and it will be a start in trying to cope with this problem, but it is extremely difficult.
Let me try to get these last questions in. I think we're going to work out great. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
My question is more of an academic question than the more specific ones that have been asked already. Is it plausible for it's a tax question. Is it plausible to replace the current income tax system with a flat tax system? And are there any problems with the flat tax system that might come about? And also, how would a flat tax system affect our current economy?
Who can deal with that in a few minutes? That we could spend the afternoon talking about, but obviously a very provocative question.
Well, is it possible? Yes. Is it desirable? No. I mean, I have a lot of suggestions I'd like to see for changes in the income tax system. Most obviously is this whole question of simplification. When we engaged in the last really major tax reform a dozen years or so ago, the bill started out as the Tax Reform and Simplification Act, and after about 3 months, even Congress gagged on that, and they dropped the "and simplification." And I think things are getting worse. What's happened in the last couple of years to the income tax system, it seems to me, is all Halloween and hardware, to use Kurt Vonnegut's statement. But I guess I'm an eternal optimist. I would think that the system, that it's not impossible to do some constructive things with the present system, and that a flat tax is not the way to go.
John.
Yeah, I think politically the flat tax is very difficult right now, but it has a lot of attractive features to it, including the encouragement of saving that we've all called for in this panel. It also has a great deal of simplicity associated with it. There's problems that have come up already with respect to people already have tax deduction of mortgage interest and charitable deductions. But it seems to me that having a discussion about tax reform is useful. Ultimately, it seems to me this is going to be a grassroots change. People are going to say we need a reform, we need to have change. It's not fair that these people are not paying very much tax. It seems to me it's going to be grassroots if it's going to occur. I hope it does occur, because the tax system is really still a real impediment to a lot of people.
Let's try to get a minute or two in on these last couple of questions. Yes, sir.
This is on personal savings rate. You know, there's a line from Oliver Fagan's line, when you're old and it's cold, no one cares if you live or you die. The one consolation's the money you may have set by, right? Appropriate for a school setting with a theater. And a couple of things have happened recently, relatively, in my lifetime, and that is, I think that I'm going to get to live older. I mean, the Cold War's over. I no longer really believe that it's all going to end in a kaboom. And unlike my parents, I believe Social Security won't be sufficient for the quality of life I wish to lead in my old age. So I think things that encourage that message, that you've got a reasonable chance at living longer, and Social Security maybe is going to be the bottom of the safety net, but you probably don't want to live that way, and it has big problems. Well, what about things, it's a related question perhaps to my neighbors, what about changes from more, to more of a consumption-based taxing system that would encourage savings, that would, I mean, we spend a tremendous amount of energy in this economy selling stuff, making me, the consumer, want to buy. Why not some more energy that makes me want to save. A little bit more help with the IRAs and things with the tax policy, a good way to spend some of the surplus perhaps, but also make it more expensive to spend the next increment of income.
Paul, you and John have been our tax experts. You want to tackle that one as well, or?
Well, I don't claim to be a CPA, particularly at this time of the year. Of course, when you introduce IRAs, you're introducing some of the same sorts of things logically that you would with a consumption-based tax, so that logically there's a lot of overlap there. Clearly we are making IRAs more generous. I think that's desirable. Although if I could put in just a word of a specific technical word, most of the literature on the Roth IRAs make a big thing about the interest being tax exempt, implying that it's much better than the regular IRAs. Well, that statement is technically correct. They are tax exempt. But compared to the regular IRAs, it turns out it doesn't make a damn bit of difference. And I wish the financial literature I would get would reflect that.
John passes. Yes, sir. You have the last question.
I have a very simple question.
Make it a tough one.
I have a very simple question. How about the IMF issue? What do you think the IMF is a very practical solution for the third world countries? Because it doesn't seem to be working. The IMF.
IMF, as I understand your question, the IMF does not seem to be working.
It earlier.
And you're curious what other kinds of instrument or what entity might be put in place.
It doesn't seem to me to be a very practical solution.
I would say the IMF has been very successful. We have not repeated the mistakes of the early 1930s, and it would be very easy to do. We have kept the international financial system functioning. If you go back and read the history of what happened between 1929 and 1934, it was just one bad policy after another and one disaster after another. And we have all these institutions which have come in, and I think that we have run an enormously successful economy since the end of World War II.
Poor in terms of performance and economics and all that sort of stuff. I don't know, and
if I could add one
that's where they rely on in getting assistance and all that.
It seems to me, though, that the World Trade Organization and its effects are really more what you'd point to with respect to the point you're making, Nancy, that we haven't had a trade war. We haven't had those kinds of things with respect to, like we did in the 1930s. But I think that's more the trade policy. And the World Trade Organization, I think, is working well.
The international financial system in 1930 completely collapsed, and that we have not had that.
That's because of an IMF wouldn't have made any difference on that. That's the U.S. Federal Reserve policy had enormous
Whatever
mistakes.
the policies are, and it includes the IMF, I think we've run a very successful world economy.
But the point that John made earlier is that because the IMF has been dealing with countries that get themselves into hot water, you've got a moral hazard problem. And that is an issue that has to be dealt with, I think. And I would make the analogy to the regulatory policies, financial regulatory policies in the U.S. of, say, 20 to 30 years ago, when one could argue validly that bailing out big banks was bad public policy, and letting them fail was still worse. And what we've been doing for the past 20 to 30 years is try to work ourselves into a position by a variety of regulatory changes where you can let a big bank go down the tubes and let it learn its lessons. And I think the IMF has to evolve over time in that same direction also, but it's going to take a heck of a long time to get there.
Yes, Dan.
I'd just like to add something about the moral hazard problem. A lot of people have mentioned that a problem with the IMF, as with any lender of last resort, is that if people know they'll be bailed out at the end of the day, they have less reason to be cautious in making investments. With respect to the Asian crisis, from the point of view of the countries that are borrowing, clearly they have suffered a great deal of pain. I don't think the moral hazard problem applies at all to the borrowers. And even with respect to the lenders, You've had a great deal of lending outside of bank lending, lending to corporations, investments in equities. Lots of people have taken pain. Now, with respect to the banks, I think there is some validity in the idea that there is a moral hazard issue. But if I could go back to the superhighway example I gave you earlier, we have superhighways. They play a very useful role. You could say that asking that people wear seatbelts in cars is a bad thing to do because there's research that shows that when people wear seatbelts, they're less careful. So that's the moral hazard problem. If I wear a seatbelt, I may be less careful when I drive. I don't think anybody would say, though, that because of that problem, it would be wise not to wear seatbelts when you drive on superhighways. And the end to me is, yes, moral hazard's an issue, but not sufficient to think that it would be a wise idea not to have the IMF playing a partial lender of last resort role.
Let me say, as we run out of time, I've been on panels where I had one last 10-second something. I was dying for somebody to give me a chance to get on the table. And let me ask my panelists if anybody has one of those kinds of issues they were waiting for me to provide a hook to get to that they didn't get a chance to offer to the group. Anybody have anything? Paul? Now's your shot. Nancy? Bob?
Very well done.
I just want to say, next time, have education and regulation as a more of a focus, but you covered every other issue so well, I won't count that.
Before, I'm going to have my colleague Bob Eisenbeiss come up and say the final thank you to the panelists for the time they've spent with us today. But as he's coming up, let me also say my thanks for the very direct, very open, very provocative way you've dealt with some of the most sensitive issues of the day. It's been great having you here in Atlanta. Bob, would you like to? Where's Bob?
Exemplifies exactly what we were hoping for in terms of having both a useful debate, and it's also very clear that when you get competent, well-qualified people, they do in fact send and shed a lot of light on some important issues. We covered a lot of topics, as John has said. It reminds me of what John Cook said of George Yellen when he hired him to be the coach of the Redskins, that he had given him an unlimited budget and he quickly exceeded it. Well, we gave the panelists an unlimited budget in terms of topics, and they covered almost every one of them in ways and with a depth and of thoughtfulness that we could only hope for. So I want to extend again my thanks on behalf of the bank to your participation, and thank you very much for coming, folks.
Economic paradigm in which the traditional measures of things like capacity utilization, sustainable economic growth, and the natural rate of unemployment may either not be relevant or not quantified as they were in the past. Others, after working through the various factors that seem to have contributed to our current economic prosperity, have concluded that better economic policy, both fiscal policy and monetary policy, is the most important explanation of what's going on. Clearly, one of the dividends of our well-performing economy has been the prospect of a federal budget surplus as early as this year, after years of large federal deficits. What should we do with that new surplus? Return it to the taxpayer, who is presently more heavily burdened by government tax policy than ever before? Or should we plan to redirect those funds to address the tough problems that anyone who looks in the future over the next 25 years will see? Namely, a host of big bills coming due to fund Social Security and Medicare. And then in the realm of monetary policy, where we have had little recent experience with policy formulation in a low inflation environment. What should our guide be to policy, and what are the trade-offs of targeting an even lower level of inflation? And then how should we be thinking about our more global economy, how developments in one part of the world can quickly spread across continents? The Oglethorpe and Atlanta Fed organizers today's event felt that the insights of those who have been policymakers and who are current policymakers and advisors might be especially insightful as we try to answer those kinds of questions. Let me tell you our plan for the morning. First, each of our distinguished speakers will make a short statement addressing one or more of the economic issues of the day. After we've heard from all of our panelists, we'll take a short break. After that break, we'll come back and reconvene for an open discussion among the panelists, and I suspect that will be lively and provocative. And then we're going to leave time at the end for some interaction between the audience and the panel with Q&A and some debate back and forth among the larger group. I'm going to come back in the audience and join you for the first discussions. Dr. Janet Yellen will begin with her views, and then each of the other panelists in turn will come to the microphone. Janet, welcome to the podium.
Thank you, Jack. It's a pleasure for me to participate today in a discussion of economic priorities for the United States in the 21st century. I think this is an opportune moment to look forward, not only because the 21st century is close at hand, but also because we're enjoying, as Jack mentioned, the best economic performance we've seen in decades, with unemployment and inflation at the lowest levels in a generation, and also a federal budget that's in near balance. If we maintain the fiscal discipline that's now in place, budget surpluses over the next decade are projected to reach $1 trillion. And I think it's in good economic times like these that we have the luxury and the resources to anticipate problems ahead and have the foresight to prepare for them. In my opening remarks, I'd like to focus on two entirely different 21st century economic problems that I think command our attention now. One is Social Security, the other is an environmental problem, namely climate change. Let me begin by talking about Social Security reform, which the President deemed top priority in his State of the Union address. In fact, the President today is in Kansas City participating in the Social Security Forum this morning, and it's the first of many such fora to be held around the country this year that will allow Americans to explore alternative solutions to the problems of the Social Security system. Following a White House conference in December, the President has proposed to begin bipartisan negotiations with the congressional leaders to devise a comprehensive plan to strengthen the finances of the Social Security system. Now, before I talk about the problems facing Social Security, I want to particularly emphasize how important Social Security is to the lives of Americans and how successful this program has been. For about 60 years now, Social Security has provided Americans with income, America's workforce more productive in the future, and enlarging the total size of our economic pie, namely our gross domestic product, which is what we will have available in the future to support both workers and retirees. And in the final analysis, a larger economic pie, which results from higher national saving, is really the prerequisite to meeting the retirement costs of retirees without unduly burdening future workers. Let me briefly turn to a discussion now of a very different issue, but also one that will affect our well-being in the 21st century, and that concerns climate change. Scientists have concluded that as a result of human activity, particularly the burning of fossil fuels, concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have already reached levels well above those of pre-industrial times. The ultimate consequence will be a gradual but inexorable warming of the Earth's surface due to the greenhouse effect. If growth in global emissions continue unabated, The atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide will likely double relative to pre-industrial levels midway through the next century, leading to increases in mean global temperature of between 2 and 6 degrees Fahrenheit in the next 100 years, with further increases thereafter. This poses a significant risk to the world's climate and to human well-being. Some of the potential impacts include a rise in sea levels, a greater frequency of severe weather events, shifts in agricultural growing conditions from changing weather patterns, threats to human health from increased range and incidence of diseases, changes in the availability of fresh water supplies, and damages to ecosystems and biodiversity. In addition, there are risks of large-scale and potentially irreversible events with possibly catastrophic consequences, such as warming of the northern tundra sufficient to release large amounts of methane from the permafrost, leading to accelerated warming, or a possible shift in ocean currents, including a weakening of the Gulf Stream that warms Western Europe. This is the motivation, clearly, for wanting to deal with climate change as an issue. There are two aspects of climate change I'd point to that make it an economic problem and a potentially very challenging one. First, climate change entails a global externality. Emissions of different greenhouse gases anywhere in the world have the identical effect on global climate, and dealing with this externality clearly necessitates cooperation on a global scale. No single country has an incentive to reduce emissions enough to protect the world environment, and every country has an incentive to free ride on the efforts of others. But even if the United States and all the developed countries reduced emissions sharply, greenhouse gas emissions in aggregate would still grow, and it wouldn't help much. By 2030, the emissions of developing countries are expected to surpass those of industrial countries. The second reason climate change is an economic challenge relates to the costs of abating it. There simply has to be a serious effort to contain costs, for without such an effort, the cost of such a project could prove unacceptable. And I think that's where economics can make a large contribution by showing how flexible and market-based mechanisms can be used to bring about greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the cheapest and most efficient ways. Such mechanisms for dealing with externalities, including the use of tradable permit systems to limit emissions of pollutants as an alternative to more costly and more onerous command and control regulations, have proven valuable in a number of circumstances, including limiting emissions of sulfur dioxide that are responsible for acid rain. Such an efficient approach to climate change would involve looking around the globe to reduce emissions wherever they're cheapest. We know that energy efficiency differs from security in retirement and also protection against loss of family income due to disability or death. A very large share of elderly Americans rely on Social Security as their primary source of pension income in retirement. For example, the average monthly retirement benefit, which amounts to $756, is the major source of income for 2/3 of those over 65, and it is virtually the only source of income for 1/3 of older Americans. Now, Social Security is actually much more than just a pension plan. It's a family protection plan, and 1 in 3 beneficiaries are actually not retirees. It provides survivor's benefits for the average wage earner who dies and leaves a spouse and 2 children that's equivalent to a $322,000 life insurance policy. And it provides disability protection as well. The problems facing Social Security are a natural consequence of the demographic change that's underway in the United States and around the world. Back in 1935, when the Social Security Act was passed, American life expectancy for a person who'd attained the age of 65 was about 12.5 years. Now it's 18.1 years and rising. At the same time, people are retiring earlier, and birth rates have also fallen. And all of that has put us on a path of rapid decline in the number of employed workers for every retired American. In 1960, that ratio was 4.5 to 1. Today, it's 3.3 to 1. In 30 years' time, it will be about 2 to 1 and continuing to fall. Social Security was set up as a pay-as-you-go system, with current workers' payroll tax contributions going to support the income of those in retirement. And clearly, the demographic transition I just described will place strains on the finances of such a system. Right now, payroll tax revenues into Social Security exceed outflows, and the excess is placed in a trust fund which is invested in Treasury securities. However, by 2012, it's expected that outflows will exceed revenues, leading eventually to a decline in trust fund balances, and by 2029, the trust fund will be depleted, leaving insufficient revenues to fund the benefits that are promised under current laws. That is the sense in which there is a problem with Social Security that needs to be fixed. Now, although Social Security suffers from a financial problem, I think public perception has exaggerated the magnitude of the problem, because polls suggest that many young people doubt that Social Security will be there for them at all. However, even if nothing is done, not what I'm proposing, and the trust fund is exhausted, payroll taxes would still be sufficient to permanently finance roughly 75% of benefits. So I would conclude there is a problem, but it's not insurmountable. Many solutions have been proposed to shore up the finances of Social Security, and I think it's too early to judge the possible outcome of what needs to be a national debate and assessment. Even so, the President proposed that not one penny of any budget surplus should be touched until a comprehensive solution for Social Security is devised, because those surpluses could play a role in solving the problems of Social Security, and more broadly, they could help the nation prepare for its demographic transition. By way of illustration, every $100 billion of surplus that's transferred to Treasury bonds in the trust fund could delay the exhaustion of the trust fund by about a year. And if the funds were invested instead in equity, which would provide an even higher return, there would be a greater financial benefit to Social Security, although such a move would be controversial and entail somewhat greater risks. There's an added benefit from an economic standpoint of reserving the surpluses, because these surpluses augment national saving and investment, making
through the years and for what they are continuing to do, and for taking the time to share relevant, important information with us today. I want to thank especially Jack Gwynn, my colleague in this project, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and a trustee, I'm happy to say, of Oglethorpe University. I want to express appreciation to Mr. Bob Eisenbeis, Senior Vice President and Director of Economic Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and to Dr. Bill Shropshire, Callaway Professor at Oglethorpe University. Dr. Shropshire and Mr. Eisenbeis conceived the idea for this symposium and organized the program. And Dr. Shropshire at this time has the privilege of introducing our very distinguished panelist, Dr. William Shropshire.
The original idea for this symposium was actually that of Dr. Dean Tucker, the chair of Oglethorpe's Division of Business Administration and Economics. And when Dr. Tucker first thought of this, he said we should arrange this symposium to coincide with the establishment of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, the 50th anniversary of that establishment. Well, those of you who know your history realize we missed that by about 2 years. The founding was actually in 1946, not 1948. Dr. Tucker's other idea was that we assemble a panel of people from the current and previous administrations, from the Council and from the Board of Governors. In this second objective, we have succeeded wonderfully, I must say. We have assembled here an outstanding panel, and all those who have been aware of both policy making and policy research for any part of the last 20 years will agree with me that this panel is indeed outstanding. I want to introduce the panel to you in chronological order, that is the order in which they began their service. Yeah, not age. This is only when they began their service. And I'll start then with Lyle Gramley, who was appointed to the Council of Economic Advisors in 1977. He also served on the Board of Governors beginning in 1980. The second, and this is Mr. Gramley here. I don't know whether you can see the signs or not. Mr. Gramley here. And then next is Nancy Teeters, who was appointed to the Board of Governors in 1978. Third is Robert Heller, to my right here. He was appointed to the Board of Governors in 1986. Next is John Taylor on the end on my left, who was appointed to the Council of Economic Advisors in 1989. And then Paul Wanacott, to my right, who was appointed to the Council in 1991. And then Janet Yellen, on my left, who was appointed to the Board of Governors in 1994, and then to the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in 1997. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Mr. Jack Gwynn, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, who will moderate the panel.
Thank you, Bill, and let me add my good morning and welcome to everyone that's here with us today. The Atlanta Fed is delighted and pleased to be Oglethorpe's partner in bringing you this program today. As we approach the new millennium, we find ourselves in the 8th year of an economic expansion that has brought us a combination of strong growth, low inflation, and low unemployment that we have not seen in this country since the 1960s. These days, those of us in economic policy-making roles in this country are constantly being asked two fundamental questions over and over again. First, why is the U.S. economy performing so well at the moment? And second, can it last, and what can we do to help that happen? To help us answer these questions and see what lessons we can learn for the future, we have the extraordinary group of former and current members of the Council of Economic Advisors and the Fed Board of Governors that have just been introduced to you by Bill. To frame this morning's discussion, I would note that some observers and some economic practitioners are talking about a new
Good morning. Thank you for responding. My name is Donald Stanton. I'm the president of Oglethorpe University, and it's with great pleasure that I, on behalf of Jack Gwynn and his colleagues at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and my colleagues at Oglethorpe University, that I'm able to welcome you to the Miriam H. and John A. Conant Performing Arts Center on our campus. You are busy people, but I hope that at least some of you will take a few moments to reflect while you're here, to walk around the campus a little bit and see a little bit of what it's like to be near students and faculty again. For example, if you have time, you may want to stop by at the Oglethorpe University Museum, where there are personal items that belong to the Dalai Lama. We invite you to visit our museum anytime between 12 and 5 o'clock this afternoon. It's at the 3rd floor of the Philip Weltner Library, which is directly in front of this building. The panelists today will be dealing with some fundamental issues which have an impact on the lives of all people, including those gathered here and indeed all of us. A university sometimes seems to be an isolated place of learning. We have a wall around this campus. We have Gothic architecture. We see faculty and students in conversation and what may appear to an outsider to be quiet reflection. But we at Oglethorpe University, along with our colleagues at other colleges and universities, watch very closely as economic leaders make decisions that will have an impact on us as well as others. Think for just a brief moment about the impact on higher education as these issues are worked through. Inflation is not just a number. It has an impact on what it costs us to do business, even as it costs you to do your work. It has an impact on what our charges will be. Economic prosperity, which has been so exciting in recent times, or the lack of economic prosperity, makes a real difference about whether families can invest tuition in private colleges and universities, or state institutions for that matter. Unemployment, fortunately low today, has over the years had a real influence on some colleges and universities. I remember when I was president of a private college in Michigan that the economy began to fall apart. Not only did we have double-digit inflation, but unemployment in Michigan was increasingly frightening. And it affected in a very direct and personal way the students who were unable to pay the tuition, and it meant a difference as to whether they could stay in college or not. The stock market appears to be something of interest for people of wealth, but it is increasingly important to all of us. Our endowment relates, of course, to the market. And personally, there are some of us who call up on our computers almost daily TIAA CREF data, and as the market goes up, we smile at each other, and if the market shows signs of trembling, we tremble too. The deficit or the surplus affects us. It's obvious that a negative impact comes from a deficit. A surplus sometimes causes us to get excited so that when college presidents get together, they say, well, with this new surplus, that will mean money, won't it, for scholarships, for humanities, for science. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it does not. The point is that these are not abstract issues, but they are vital issues for all of us. And we listen with interest, along with those of you gathered here in this group, to what these experts will say. We appreciate their leadership. We are excited about the gathering of so much intellectual power in one place at one time. We're genuinely grateful to these leaders for what they have done